Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Officer Brandon Martinez had been working night patrol in Millfield County for 8 years. And in that time, he'd seen just about everything you could imagine in a small Midwestern town. Domestic violence calls where husbands had beaten their wives bloody, drug deals gone wrong in abandoned parking lots, teenagers wrapped around telephone poles because they thought they were invincible behind the wheel of Daddy's pickup truck. He'd talked suicidal people off bridges, chased armed robbers through cornfields, and held dying accident victims in his arms while waiting for paramedics who sometimes arrived too late to make any difference. The job had a way of wearing you down, stripping away whatever illusions you might have had about human nature. But Brandon had always prided himself on being able to handle whatever came his way with professionalism and a level head. That confidence was about to be tested in ways he never could have imagined when he received what seemed like a routine domestic disturbance call on a cold Tuesday night in October of 2022. The call came in at 11:47 p.m., crackling through his radio with the usual static and background noise that characterized late-night communications with dispatch. Unit 23, we have a domestic disturbance. Possible verbal altercation at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Caller reports shouting and possible property damage. Brandon acknowledged the call with a quick, Unit 23 responding, and turned his patrol car toward Oakwood Drive, a quiet residential street on the north side of town that was lined with modest two-story homes, most of them built in the 1970s when the local manufacturing plant was still operating and bringing steady paychecks to working-class families. Oakwood Drive was the kind of neighborhood where most people knew each other's names, where kids still rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, and where the biggest excitement was usually the annual 4th of July block party. Brandon had been to this particular address twice before, both times responding to noise complaints involving the Hendricks family. Jerry Hendricks was a long-haul trucker in his early 40s with a drinking problem that seemed to get worse every time his route took him away from home for extended periods. His wife Sarah worked double shifts at the county hospital as a certified nursing assistant, trying to keep the family financially afloat while also raising their 2 young children, a 10-year-old boy named Michael and an 8-year-old girl named Emma. It was one of those marriages that seemed to be held together by exhaustion, stubbornness, and the shared responsibility of keeping their kids fed and housed, rather than any genuine affection or compatibility. As Brandon pulled his patrol car up to the curb in front of 1247 Oakwood Drive, he immediately noticed that something was different about this call compared to his previous visits to the Hendricks residence. Usually, when he responded to domestic disturbances, there were obvious signs of conflict. Lights on throughout the house, raised voices that could be heard from the street, sometimes a neighbor or two standing on their porches in bathrobes and slippers, drawn outside by the commotion. Tonight, however, 1247 Oakwood Drive was completely dark, with not a single light visible in any of the windows. The entire house appeared to be sleeping peacefully, which struck Brandon as odd, considering that someone had called in a complaint about shouting and property damage less than 20 minutes earlier. Brandon activated his patrol car's spotlight and aimed it toward the front of the house, illuminating the small yard and revealing details that made his stomach tighten with unease. An aluminum lawn chair had been overturned near the front porch, and what looked like broken glass was scattered across the concrete driveway, sparkling like tiny diamonds in the harsh white light. There was also something else. a dark stain on the driveway that could have been motor oil or transmission fluid, but somehow looked too thick, too red in the artificial light. Brandon keyed his radio and reported his arrival to dispatch. Unit 23 on scene at 1247 Oakwood Drive. House appears dark. No obvious signs of current activity, but there is evidence of some kind of disturbance in the front yard. I'm going to make contact with the residents and assess the situation. He stepped out of his patrol car, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the grip of his service weapon. Not because he expected trouble, but because 8 years of night patrol had taught him that the calls that seemed the most routine were often the ones that turned dangerous without warning. The October air was crisp and still, carrying the familiar sense of autumn in the Midwest. Wood smoke from someone's fireplace, the musty smell of wet leaves decomposing in gutters, and underneath it all, a faint metallic odor that Brandon couldn't immediately identify. As he walked up the short concrete path to the front porch, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him, Brandon noticed that the usual sounds of late-night suburbia seemed muted tonight. No distant televisions flickering behind curtained windows, no humming of air conditioning units or heating systems, no dogs barking at his presence, just an oppressive silence that felt almost physical in its weight. The front door of the Hendricks house was slightly ajar, maybe an inch or two, which immediately set off alarm bells in Brandon's mind. Jerry Hendricks might have been a drunk, and Sarah might have been overwhelmed by her responsibilities, but they were both careful about home security, especially with 2 young children in the house. Brandon had never known them to leave their front door unlocked, let alone standing open in the middle of the night. Millfield County Police, Brandon called out in a clear, authoritative voice that was designed to carry throughout the house without sounding unnecessarily aggressive. I'm responding to a noise complaint. Is anyone home? I need to speak with the residents of this address. He waited for a response, listening carefully for any sounds of movement or voices from inside the house, but heard nothing except the faint creaking of the house settling and the distant hum of electrical wires overhead. Brandon used his flashlight to push the front door open wider, revealing a narrow view into the Hendricks family's living room. What he saw made him immediately radio for backup, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Something about the scene just felt fundamentally wrong, in a way that his 8 years of experience couldn't quite categorize. The living room was in complete disarray, with couch cushions scattered across the floor, a wooden coffee table overturned and lying on its side, and family photographs knocked off their perches on the fireplace mantel, their glass frames cracked and reflecting his flashlight beam in fractured patterns. Unit 23 to dispatch, Brandon spoke into his radio, trying to keep his voice steady and professional despite the growing sense of unease that was creeping up his spine. I have signs of a possible break-in or serious domestic altercation at 1247 Oakwood Drive. I'm going to clear the residence, but I want backup en route as a precautionary measure. He waited for dispatch to acknowledge his request, but instead of the usual crisp response, his radio crackled with static so loud and harsh that he had to turn down the volume. When the static finally cleared, he tried again, but got only dead air in response. Brandon stepped carefully into the house, his service weapon now drawn and held in a low, ready position, while his flashlight beam swept methodically across the interior. The living room showed clear signs of a struggle. Not just the overturned furniture and scattered photographs, but also what looked like scuff marks on the hardwood floor, as if someone had been dragged or had struggled violently enough to leave marks with their shoes. There were also dark spots on the floor that could have been blood, though Brandon couldn't be certain without proper lighting and forensic analysis. Moving deeper into the house, Brandon found that the kitchen was in even worse condition than the living room. Cabinet doors hung open, their contents spilled across the linoleum floor, broken dishes, scattered utensils, boxes of cereal and canned goods rolled under the small dining table. A wooden chair had been knocked over near the kitchen window, and the glass in that window was spider-webbed with cracks, as if someone had been thrown against it with considerable force. Brandon tried his radio again, hoping to reach dispatch or at least make contact with other units in the area, but the device seemed to be completely dead, not even static now, just silence. He pulled out his cell phone and was frustrated but not entirely surprised to see that he had no signal bars. Cell service had always been spotty in this part of town, especially inside older houses with thick walls and outdated electrical systems that could interfere with modern communications equipment. In the hallway that connected the kitchen to the bedrooms, Brandon discovered something that made his blood run cold and caused him to grip his weapon more tightly. Taped to the wall at a child's eye level was a drawing that had obviously been created by young Emma Hendricks, a typical family portrait done in crayon, showing stick figure representations of what were clearly meant to be her parents and brother. But someone had taken a black crayon and methodically scribbled over all the faces in the drawing, turning the smiling family into faceless, dark silhouettes that seemed to stare accusingly at Brandon as his flashlight beam illuminated them. The bedrooms revealed more evidence of violence and chaos. In the master bedroom, dresser drawers had been pulled out and overturned, their contents scattered across the floor as if someone had been frantically searching for something specific. Clothes were everywhere. Shirts and pants and undergarments strewn about in a pattern that suggested desperate haste rather than methodical searching. The bed itself had been stripped of its sheets and blankets, which were nowhere to be seen, and the mattress showed what looked like knife cuts or claw marks across its surface. The children's room was even more disturbing, though in a more subtle way that took Brandon several moments to fully process. At first glance, it simply looked messy. Toys scattered across the floor, books pulled from shelves, stuffed animals thrown about randomly. But as Brandon examined the scene more carefully, he began to notice that the toys weren't just scattered randomly. They had been arranged in deliberate patterns, almost like symbols or messages that he couldn't quite decipher. Building blocks spelled out words in a language he didn't recognize. Action figures were positioned in poses that seemed ritualistic or ceremonial, and crayons had been broken and arranged in geometric patterns that hurt his eyes to look at directly. Brandon was about to call for backup on his cell phone, despite the lack of signal, when he heard something that made every muscle in his body tense and his finger moved to the trigger of his service weapon. It was a soft, thudding sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere below his feet. The basement. Brandon had never been in the Hendricks house before tonight, but like most houses in this neighborhood, it almost certainly had a basement that would be accessed through a door somewhere on the first floor. Brandon found the basement door in the kitchen, painted white, but now showing fresh scuff marks and what looked like deep scratches around the door handle, as if someone had clawed at it desperately while trying to escape. The door was secured with a deadbolt that had been engaged from the kitchen side, effectively trapping whoever might be in the basement. "This is the police," Brandon called down toward the basement, his voice carrying a note of authority that he hoped would reassure any potential victims, while also serving as a warning to any potential perpetrators. "If anyone is down there, please respond immediately. I am here to help." The thudding sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Brandon could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds, he heard something that made his hands shake and his mouth go dry with fear. It was a child's voice, very quiet and muffled by the basement door, saying, "Help us, please, help us." Brandon tried his radio one more time, knowing it was futile but desperate to establish contact with backup or dispatch or anyone else in the outside world. The radio remained dead, and his cell phone still showed no signal. he was completely cut off from any assistance, facing an unknown situation in a house where violence had clearly occurred, with potential victims trapped in the basement and no idea where the perpetrator might be. The basement door was solid wood with a heavy deadbolt lock that had been designed to keep intruders out, but was now being used to keep victims in. Brandon searched through the kitchen drawers until he found a screwdriver and a hammer, then worked quickly but carefully to remove the hinges from the door. It was slow, frustrating work. Each screw seemed to be painted over and resistant to removal, and Brandon was acutely aware that every second he spent working on the door was another second that potential victims remained trapped, and another second that their attacker might use to escape or prepare for confrontation. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, Brandon managed to remove enough screws to pull the door free from its frame. The basement stairs descended into complete darkness, and Brandon's flashlight beam revealed rough concrete walls and wooden steps that creaked ominously under his weight as he began his descent. "Police! I'm coming down!" Brandon announced as he moved carefully down the stairs, his weapon drawn and his flashlight sweeping back and forth to illuminate as much of the basement as possible. "I'm here to help. If you're injured, stay where you are and let me know where you are." At the bottom of the stairs, Brandon found himself in a typical unfinished basement with a concrete floor, exposed ceiling joists, and that distinctive musty smell that seemed to permeate every basement in houses of this age. But there was another smell too. That same metallic, coppery odor he had noticed outside, only stronger down here in the confined space. In the far corner of the basement, huddled together on an old mattress that had been placed directly on the concrete floor, were Sarah Hendricks and her 2 children. All 3 were alive, but clearly traumatized, their eyes wide with terror in Brandon's flashlight beam, their faces pale and streaked with tears. Sarah had her arms wrapped protectively around both children, and Brandon could see that she had what looked like rope burns around her wrists, as if she had been restrained, but had somehow managed to free herself. "Thank God," Sarah whispered when she recognized Brandon's police uniform in the flashlight beam. "Thank God you're here. I thought he was going to come back, and—" "Are any of you injured?" Brandon asked, holstering his weapon and moving toward them while keeping his flashlight trained on the family rather than shining it directly in their eyes. "Do you need immediate medical attention?" "We're okay," Sarah said, though her voice was shaking so badly that Brandon could barely understand her words. "Scared, but not hurt. At least not seriously. But Jerry, oh God, what did he do to Jerry?" "Where is your husband, Mrs. Hendricks?" Brandon asked, helping Sarah and her children to their feet. "Where is Jerry?" Sarah's face crumpled, and she began crying harder. The man who broke in, he made Jerry go upstairs with him. We heard fighting, and Jerry was screaming, and then everything went quiet. That was hours ago. I don't know what happened to him." "Can you describe the man who did this?" Brandon asked, though he was already mentally preparing himself for the usual vague description that victims often gave when they were traumatized and scared. "Did you recognize him? Had you seen him before?" It was young Emma who answered, her voice so quiet that Brandon had to lean down to hear her. "He didn't have a face," she said, clutching a stuffed bear that was missing one ear. "The man didn't have a face, just smooth skin where his face should be." Brandon felt ice water run down his spine, though he tried to maintain his professional composure for the sake of the victims. "What do you mean, honey? Was he wearing a mask of some kind?" "No mask," said Michael, the 10-year-old boy, speaking for the first time since Brandon had found them. "We saw him real close when he made us come down here. He looked like a person, but where his eyes and nose and mouth should be, there was just skin. Like a doll that never got finished." Sarah nodded, confirming her children's account. "I know how it sounds, officer, but that's what we all saw. A tall man in dark clothes, but with no facial features at all. He broke in around 10 o'clock tonight, and when Jerry went to investigate the noise, this man just appeared. Jerry tried to fight him, but the man was too strong and too fast. He forced all of us down here and locked the door." Brandon's radio suddenly crackled to life, making everyone jump. Through heavy static, he heard dispatch trying to reach him. "Unit 23, what's your status?" "You've been off the air for over 30 minutes." Brandon keyed his radio, relieved to finally have communication restored. "Unit 23, I'm at 1247 Oakwood Drive in the basement with 3 victims of a home invasion. I need backup immediately, and I need an ambulance for potential injuries. Be advised that we have 1 missing adult male, possibly deceased, and a dangerous suspect who may still be in the area. Copy Unit 23, backup and medical are en route. ETA approximately 5 minutes. Brandon turned back to the Hendricks family. "Help is coming. We're going to get you out of here safely. Can you walk? Are you able to climb the stairs?" Sarah nodded, helping her children stand up from the mattress. "We can walk, but officer, what if he's still upstairs? What if he's waiting for us?" Brandon had been wondering the same thing. "Stay close behind me," he instructed. "We're going to move together, slowly and quietly. If I tell you to run, you run straight out the front door and don't look back." As they began climbing the basement stairs, Brandon listened carefully for any sounds of movement from the floors above. At first, he heard nothing but the usual creaking and settling sounds of an old house, but then, very faintly, he became aware of footsteps moving across the floor above their heads. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to be following a pattern, from the living room to the kitchen to the hallway and back again, over and over. They reached the kitchen, and Brandon motioned for the family to stay behind him while he assessed the situation. The footsteps had stopped the moment they emerged from the basement, and the house was now completely silent again. Brandon's flashlight beam swept across the kitchen and into the living room beyond, revealing the same scene of destruction he had observed earlier. But now he noticed something else: wet footprints on the linoleum floor that hadn't been there before, leading from the back door to the basement door and then toward the front of the house. Then Brandon saw him. Standing in the archway between the living room and the hallway was a tall figure dressed in dark clothing, jeans and a black hoodie with the hood pulled up. Brandon's flashlight beam hit the figure full in what should have been his face, and Brandon immediately understood what the Hendricks family had been trying to tell him. Where the man's face should have been was smooth, pale skin stretched tight over the underlying bone structure. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just an expanse of flesh that looked like it had never been properly formed, or like features had been somehow erased or smoothed away. It was the most profoundly disturbing thing Brandon had ever seen in 8 years of police work, and for a moment he was too shocked to react. The figure didn't move when the flashlight beam hit him. He didn't flinch away from the light or raise his hands to shield his non-existent eyes. He simply stood there, perfectly still, as if Brandon's presence was of no consequence to him whatsoever. Brandon raised his service weapon, training it on the figure's center mass. "Police, get on the ground now! Get on the ground with your hands where I can see them!" The figure tilted his head slightly, as if listening to Brandon's commands with interest, but no intention of complying. Then he began to move, walking slowly toward them with that same deliberate, measured pace that Brandon had heard from upstairs. "I said, get on the ground!" Brandon shouted, his finger moving to the trigger of his weapon. "This is your final warning." The figure continued walking toward them, and now Brandon could see more details in his flashlight beam. The man was tall, probably 6 feet 2 or 3, with a heavy build that suggested physical strength. His movements were fluid, but somehow wrong, as if he wasn't quite accustomed to moving in a human body. And that face, or lack of face, was even more disturbing up close. The skin wasn't just smooth, it was perfect, without any of the small imperfections or variations in tone that normal human skin would have. It looked artificial, manufactured. Behind Brandon, he heard Sarah gasp and whisper to her children, "That's him. That's the man who took your father." Brandon made a split-second decision and fired his weapon twice, aiming for center mass just as he had been trained to do. Both shots hit their target. Brandon was an excellent marksman and was firing from less than 15 feet away, but instead of dropping or even staggering backward, the figure simply paused for a moment, looked down at his chest where the bullets had struck, then continued walking toward them. "Basement! Now!" Brandon shouted to the Hendricks family, pushing them back toward the basement door while keeping his weapon trained on the approaching figure. They scrambled back down the stairs and Brandon followed, pulling the damaged door closed behind them as best he could with the hinges partially removed. Brandon's radio crackled to life again. "Unit 23, backup is on scene outside the residence. What's your current position?" "We're in the basement," Brandon responded, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Be advised, armed suspect in the house, shots fired. Suspect appears to be wearing body armor or is otherwise resistant to gunfire. Exercise extreme caution." "Copy that, Unit 23. We're making entry now." From upstairs, Brandon could hear his backup officers announcing their presence and beginning to clear the house room by room. There were shouts of "Police! Search warrant!" followed by the sound of doors being kicked open and furniture being moved around. Then Brandon heard multiple gunshots, at least 6 or 7 rounds fired in rapid succession, followed by voices calling, "Suspect down! Suspect down!" Then silence. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, Brandon heard a familiar voice calling down the basement stairs. "Martinez! You down there? This is Sergeant Thompson?" Brandon recognized the voice of his supervisor, a 20-year veteran of the Millfield County Sheriff's Department who had been Brandon's training officer when he first started patrol. "Yeah, Sarge, we're here. 4 of us, 3 civilians and myself. Come on up, Brandon. Scene is secure." Brandon led the Hendricks family back up the basement stairs for the second time that night, emerging into a kitchen that was now filled with police officers, paramedics, and crime scene technicians. Sergeant Thompson met them at the top of the stairs, his weathered face grim and troubled. "Where's the suspect?" Brandon asked immediately. "The man I shot? The one you guys said was down." Thompson's expression grew even more serious. "That's what we need to talk about, Brandon. We found Jerry Hendricks." Brandon felt his stomach drop. "Where? How is he?" "Upstairs in the main bathroom. He's alive, but barely. Looks like he was beaten severely. Multiple contusions, possible internal injuries. Definitely needs immediate medical attention. Paramedics are working on him now, and we'll have him transported to County General within the next few minutes." "What about the suspect? The man with no face?" "I shot him twice, center mass, and he kept coming. Your guys said they put him down." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, studying Brandon's face carefully. "Brandon, we've searched every inch of this house, every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. We found no intruder, no suspect, and no evidence that anyone other than the Hendricks family has been in this house tonight." Brandon stared at his supervisor in disbelief. "That's impossible, Sarge. I saw him. I shot him. The family saw him too. He was standing right there in the living room, and he was walking toward us when I fired. I believe you saw something, Brandon, Thompson said carefully. And I believe the family saw something too. But whoever or whatever was here, he's gone now. And he didn't leave through any door or window that we can identify. No broken glass, no forced entry points, no blood trail from your shots. Brandon looked around the kitchen, trying to process what his supervisor was telling him. What about the shots you guys fired? I heard at least 6 or 7 rounds. That was Officer Davidson, Thompson explained. He thought he saw movement in the hallway and fired at what turned out to be shadows created by our flashlight beams. No one was hit because there was no one there to hit. The paramedics wheeled Jerry Hendricks out of the house on a stretcher, and Brandon could see that the man had indeed been severely beaten. His face was swollen and discolored, and he appeared to be unconscious. Sarah Hendricks rode with him in the ambulance to the hospital, while the children were taken into protective custody by social services until the situation could be fully evaluated. Over the next several hours, Brandon gave detailed statements to investigating officers, describing everything he had seen and experienced in the house. The Hendricks family corroborated his account of the faceless intruder, providing descriptions that were consistent with Brandon's observations. But despite an exhaustive search of the house and the surrounding neighborhood, no physical evidence of an intruder was ever found. The crime scene technicians processed the house thoroughly, documenting the signs of struggle and violence, collecting fingerprints and DNA samples, photographing everything from multiple angles. They found Jerry Hendricks' blood in the upstairs bathroom where he had been beaten, and they found evidence of the struggle in the living room and kitchen. But they found no fingerprints that didn't belong to the Hendricks family, no DNA evidence from an outside perpetrator, and no indication of how an intruder might have entered or exited the house. Jerry Hendricks remained in a medically induced coma for 6 days before finally regaining consciousness. When he was finally able to speak with investigators, he provided an account that was both consistent with and completely different from what his family and Brandon had reported. Yes, he had been attacked by an intruder. Yes, the man had been tall and dressed in dark clothing. But according to Jerry, the man had been wearing a ski mask or some other kind of face covering. He couldn't recall seeing the smooth, featureless face that his wife and children described. Jerry's injuries were severe: multiple fractures to his ribs and left arm, a concussion, and internal bleeding that had required emergency surgery. According to the medical reports, his injuries were consistent with being beaten with a blunt instrument, possibly a baseball bat or similar weapon, but no weapon was ever found at the scene. The case was officially classified as an unsolved home invasion and assault. The Hendricks family was provided with victim services and counseling, and additional patrols were assigned to their neighborhood for several weeks following the incident. But without any physical evidence or leads to follow, the investigation eventually went cold. Brandon returned to his regular patrol duties, but found that he couldn't shake what he had experienced that night. He had been a police officer for 8 years, and in that time he had seen plenty of things that were difficult to explain. Domestic violence cases where victims protected their abusers, drug dealers who seemed to have supernatural luck avoiding arrest, accident scenes where people survived crashes that should have been fatal. But he had never experienced anything like the faceless man in the Hendricks house. Brandon began requesting assignments to patrol the Oakwood Drive area whenever possible, hoping to encounter the intruder again, or at least to find some evidence that would help explain what had happened. He interviewed neighbors, checked with local hospitals and mental health facilities, and even researched similar cases in other jurisdictions, but he found nothing that provided any clarity or closure. 3 weeks after the incident at the Hendricks house, Brandon was working his regular night shift when he received another call to Oakwood Drive. This time, the address was 1251 Oakwood Drive, which was 4 houses down from where the Hendricks family lived. The call came in just after midnight, reported by Mrs. Helen Kowalski, a retired schoolteacher who lived alone since her husband had passed away the previous year. Unit 23. We have a report of suspicious person at 1251 Oakwood Drive, dispatch reported. Caller states someone has been walking around her backyard for the past hour, looking in windows. She's afraid to leave her bedroom. Brandon acknowledged the call and drove immediately to the address, arriving within 5 minutes of receiving the dispatch. He found Mrs. Kowalski's house dark, except for a single light in what was obviously her bedroom window on the 2nd floor. Brandon parked in front of the house and used his spotlight to illuminate the backyard, but saw no signs of any intruder. Brandon knocked on the front door and identified himself as police. Mrs. Kowalski came to the door but wouldn't open it until Brandon held his badge up to the front window where she could see it clearly. "Oh, thank goodness you're here, officer," Mrs. Kowalski said as she let Brandon into her living room. She was a small, elderly woman in her 70s, wearing a bathrobe and slippers, and she was clearly frightened. "He's been out there for over an hour, just walking back and forth, looking in my windows." "Can you describe this person, Mrs. Kowalski?" Brandon asked, though he was already feeling a familiar chill running down his spine. "He was tall, wearing dark clothes," Mrs. Kowalski said, wrapping her bathrobe more tightly around herself. "But his face... Officer, I know this sounds crazy, but I don't think he had a face. Not a normal face anyway, just smooth skin where his features should be." Brandon felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, but he maintained his professional composure. "Did you actually see this person, or did you just see a shadow or silhouette that might have looked unusual?" "I saw him clearly," Mrs. Kowalski insisted. "He was standing right outside my kitchen window, maybe 6 feet away from the glass. The motion sensor light came on, and I could see him as clearly as I can see you right now. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just blank skin stretched over his skull." Brandon called for backup immediately, then spent the next hour searching Mrs. Kowalski's property and the surrounding neighborhood. 2 other patrol units assisted in the search using spotlights and K9 units, but they found no trace of any intruder. There were no footprints in the soft soil around Mrs. Kowalski's house, no disturbed vegetation, and no evidence that anyone had been on her property. Over the next 6 months, Brandon responded to 14 similar calls along Oakwood Drive and the surrounding streets. The reports were always essentially the same: a tall figure in dark clothing with no discernible facial features, observed looking in windows or walking through yards late at night. The witnesses ranged from elderly residents like Mrs. Kowalski to young families with children, but their descriptions of the intruder were remarkably consistent. Brandon began keeping detailed records of these sightings, mapping their locations and looking for patterns. He noticed that the incidents seemed to be occurring in a specific sequence, as if the intruder was systematically working his way through the neighborhood, studying each house and its residents. The first sighting had been at the Hendricks house at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Then Mrs. Kowalski at 1251. Then the Peterson family at the 1239. Then single mother Jennifer Walsh at 1255. Each family reported the same thing: a tall, faceless figure observing their house from outside, sometimes for hours at a time, but never actually attempting to break in or make contact. And in every case, by the time police arrived, the figure had vanished without leaving any trace of his presence. Brandon became obsessed with catching this intruder, working extra shifts and spending his off-duty time patrolling the neighborhood. He set up surveillance equipment, coordinated with other officers to establish perimeters, and even arranged for undercover operations. But somehow, The faceless figure always seemed to know when police were watching, appearing only when residents were alone and unprotected. The pattern continued through the winter and into the spring of 2023, with sightings reported approximately once or twice per week. Brandon noticed that the incidents were becoming more frequent and that the intruder was becoming bolder, sometimes approaching houses in broad daylight or lingering for longer periods before disappearing. Then, in May of 2023, the pattern suddenly changed. Brandon received a call that made his blood freeze in his veins. The address was 1247 Oakwood Drive, the same house where this nightmare had begun 8 months earlier. But the Hendricks family had moved out in December, after Jerry's recovery, unable to feel safe in the house where they had been terrorized. The house had been sitting empty since then, with a for rent sign in the front yard that had attracted no interested tenants, despite the reasonable rent and decent condition of the property. Unit 23. We have a report of lights and movement inside 1247 Oakwood Drive. Dispatch reported. Caller states the house should be vacant and that there appear to be multiple people inside. Brandon acknowledged the call and drove immediately to Oakwood Drive, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. As he approached the house, he could see exactly what the caller had reported. Lights were on in several rooms, and there were shadows moving behind the curtains. Multiple figures that seemed to be walking through the house in synchronized patterns. Brandon parked across the street from the house and observed it for several minutes before calling for backup. The movements inside were rhythmic and deliberate, following the same pattern he had heard that first night. Living room to kitchen to hallway and back again, over and over. But now there appeared to be multiple figures following the same route, like some kind of strange procession or ritual. When backup arrived, Brandon and 2 other officers approached the house together. The front door was standing wide open, just as it had been on that first night 8 months earlier. The lights inside were bright, illuminating rooms that should have been empty, but instead showed clear signs of recent habitation. "Police department," Brandon called out as they entered the house. "The building is surrounded. Anyone inside needs to come out immediately with their hands visible." The movements inside the house stopped instantly, and the lights went out one by one until the entire house was plunged into darkness. Brandon and his backup officers used their flashlights to navigate through the interior, finding rooms that were exactly as the Hendricks family had left them. Empty, clean, and showing no signs that anyone had been living there. But in the living room, Brandon discovered something that made his skin crawl and confirmed his worst suspicions. The hardwood floor showed wear patterns that hadn't been there when the house was vacated. Long, dark paths worn into the wood where feet had walked the same route countless times. The pattern matched exactly what Brandon had observed and heard during his previous visits to the house. Living room to kitchen to hallway and back again. "Jesus Christ," whispered Officer Davis, one of Brandon's backup. How long would someone have to walk the same path to wear down hardwood floors like this? Brandon didn't answer because he was afraid of what the answer might be. Instead, he continued searching the house, looking for any clue that might explain what had been happening in this neighborhood for the past 8 months. In the master bedroom, he found something that made his blood run cold. Deep scratches in the hardwood floor near the window. Parallel gouges that looked like they had been made by fingernails dragging across the wood. Brandon approached the window and looked out, realizing that from this vantage point, he had a perfect view of 3 other houses on Oakwood Drive, including the residences where recent sightings had been reported. The basement was empty except for those same worn paths in the concrete floor, leading from the stairs to various corners of the room and back again. But there was something else down there that Brandon hadn't noticed during his first visit to the house. Symbols carved into the concrete walls, crude scratches that formed patterns too deliberate to be accidental, but too alien to be immediately understood. Some looked almost like letters from an alphabet Brandon didn't recognize, while others resembled mathematical equations or geometric diagrams. As Brandon and his backup officers prepared to leave the empty house, his radio crackled with another call that sent ice water through his veins. "All units, we have a report of suspicious person at 1263 Oakwood Drive. Caller reports individual looking in windows, matching description of previous reports in this area." 1263 Oakwood Drive was at the opposite end of the street from where they currently stood. Brandon looked at Officers Davis and Martinez, seeing his own realization reflected in their faces. If someone had just been in this house and was now being reported at 1263, then either they were dealing with multiple intruders working together, or they were dealing with someone who could move through the neighborhood faster than should be humanly possible. "Unit 15, respond to 1263 Oakwood Drive," Brandon radioed. "Units 23 and 24 will continue securing 1247. Be advised, suspect may be extremely mobile and may not respond normally to police presence." Unit 15 responded that they were en route, but 3 minutes later came back on the radio with a report that Brandon was beginning to expect. "Unit 15 on scene at 1263 Oakwood Drive. No sign of suspicious person. Residents report individual disappeared immediately after they called police. Negative contact." Brandon and his backup finished searching the empty house and found nothing else of significance, but the discovery of the worn floor patterns and the carved symbols in the basement suggested that someone had been using the vacant property as some kind of base of operations for months. Brandon filed a detailed report recommending that the property be kept under regular surveillance, but he knew that their department didn't have the manpower to watch an empty house around the clock. Over the next several weeks, Brandon began to notice something disturbing about the pattern of sightings around Oakwood Drive. The incidents were becoming more frequent, occurring almost nightly, and they were beginning to spread beyond the original neighborhood into adjacent streets and subdivisions. What had started as isolated reports of a single strange individual had evolved into something much larger and more coordinated. Brandon started keeping a detailed map of all the sightings, marking each incident with pins and connecting them with string to visualize the patterns. What he discovered made him lose sleep and question his own sanity. The sightings weren't random at all. They were following a methodical progression that suggested the intruder or intruders were conducting some kind of systematic survey of the entire area. The progression started with houses that had children, then moved to houses with elderly residents living alone, then to houses with single mothers or other potentially vulnerable occupants. It was as if someone was cataloging the neighborhood, identifying the most suitable targets for some unknown purpose. Brandon brought his concerns to Sergeant Thompson, presenting his map and his analysis of the pattern. Thompson listened carefully but seemed skeptical about Brandon's conclusions. "Look, Martinez," Thompson said, leaning back in his desk chair and studying the map that Brandon had spread across his desk. "I know you've been working this case hard, maybe too hard. These could all be coincidences, or copycat incidents, or even mass hysteria. You know how these things can spread through a community once people start talking." "Sarge, I've interviewed most of these witnesses personally," Brandon insisted. "These aren't people who know each other or who are sharing stories. These are independent sightings of the same individual, following the same pattern over a period of months. Someone is stalking this entire neighborhood." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, studying the map more carefully. "Even if you're right, and I'm not saying you are, what exactly do you think we can do about it? We can't arrest someone for looking in windows if we can't catch them in the act. We can't get search warrants for houses based on witness descriptions of someone with no face. and we sure as hell can't station officers on every street corner waiting for this guy to show up. Brandon knew his supervisor was right, but he also knew that something terrible was building toward a climax in his patrol area. The sightings were becoming more frequent and more brazen. The intruder was staying longer and getting closer to houses, and Brandon had a growing sense that all of this surveillance and preparation was leading towards something much worse than simple voyeurism. His fears were confirmed on a hot night in July when Brandon received a call that he had been dreading for months. The address was 1271 Oakwood Drive, home of the Morrison family. Parents, David and Linda Morrison, and their 3 young children. Brandon had met the Morrisons several weeks earlier when they reported seeing someone in their backyard, and he had warned them to be extra careful about home security and to call immediately if they saw anything suspicious. Unit 23, we have a home invasion in progress at 1271 Oakwood Drive, dispatch reported, the urgency in the dispatcher's voice cutting through the usual professional calm. Multiple callers reporting screaming and sounds of violence. All available units respond immediately. Brandon was less than 2 miles away when the call came in, and he arrived at the Morrison house within 3 minutes. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long that might turn out to be. The front door of the Morrison house was standing wide open, and Brandon could hear sounds of struggle and terror coming from inside, screaming voices, crashing furniture, and something else that sounded like multiple people moving through the house in that same deliberate, rhythmic pattern he had become so familiar with. Brandon called for backup and drew his service weapon, but this time he didn't wait for assistance before entering the house. The sounds from inside were too urgent, too desperate to allow for proper procedure and safety protocols. The living room was in chaos, with furniture overturned and family photographs scattered across the floor just like at the Hendricks house 8 months earlier. But this time, Brandon could see the perpetrators of the violence. Moving through the house with that same measured, deliberate pace were multiple figures dressed in dark clothing, all of them tall and thin and wearing hoods that obscured their faces. But as Brandon's flashlight beam caught them, several of the figures turned toward him, and he saw what he had been dreading to see. They all had the same smooth, featureless faces that the Hendricks family had described. No eyes, no noses, no mouths, just pale skin stretched tight over human skulls. Brandon raised his weapon and shouted commands that he knew would be ignored, just as they had been ignored 8 months earlier. The figures didn't respond to his presence at all, continuing their methodical movement through the house as if Brandon were invisible or irrelevant. From upstairs, Brandon could hear Linda Morrison screaming for help and children crying in terror. Brandon made a split-second decision and ran toward the stairs, pushing past several of the faceless figures who made no attempt to stop him or even acknowledge his presence. Upstairs, Brandon found David Morrison in the hallway outside his children's bedroom, unconscious and bleeding from multiple head wounds. Brandon checked quickly for a pulse and found one, weak but steady. From inside the children's room, he could hear Linda Morrison's voice trying to comfort her kids, telling them to hide under the bed and not to look at the bad men. Brandon tried to open the bedroom door but found it locked from the inside. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Officer Martinez from the Sheriff's Department. I'm here to help. Can you unlock the door?" "They're in here with us," Linda Morrison replied, her voice breaking with terror. "They came through the window. They're just standing here watching us. They won't let us leave." Brandon looked through the keyhole and could see into the children's room, which was illuminated by a small nightlight. Linda Morrison was crouched in the corner with her 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all under the age of 10. Standing around them in a circle were 5 or 6 of the faceless figures, motionless as statues but clearly preventing the family from escaping. Brandon tried to force the door, but it wouldn't budge despite his efforts. The lock was engaged from the inside, and the door was solid wood that wouldn't yield to shoulder pressure. Brandon was about to try shooting the lock when his radio crackled with the voice of Sergeant Thompson. Unit 23, we're on scene outside the residence. What's your status? I'm upstairs with victims, Brandon responded. Multiple suspects in the house, same as the previous incidents. The Morrison family is trapped in one of the bedrooms with several of the intruders. I need immediate backup upstairs. Copy that. We're coming up. Brandon heard his backup officers entering the house downstairs, their heavy boots on the hardwood floors and their voices calling out commands and identifying themselves as police. But he also heard something else that made his blood run cold. The sound of many footsteps moving in unison, as if a large group of people were walking through the house together. Sergeant Thompson and Officers Davis and Martinez reached the upstairs hallway, and Brandon briefed them quickly on the situation. They could all hear the Morrison family inside the locked bedroom, and they could all see the motionless figures standing around them through the keyhole. "We need to get that door open now," Thompson said, drawing his sidearm. "Martinez, you and Davis work on the lock. Brandon, you and I will provide cover." As Officers Martinez and Davis worked to force the bedroom door, Brandon became aware that the house had become eerily quiet. The sounds of movement from downstairs had stopped, and even the Morrison family inside the bedroom had fallen silent. "Mrs. Morrison," Brandon called through the door. "Are you okay in there? What's happening?" There was no response. Finally, Officers Martinez and Davis managed to force the door open, and Brandon's flashlight beam revealed a scene that would be burned into his memory forever. The Morrison family was huddled in the corner exactly as Brandon had seen them through the keyhole, but the faceless figures were gone. The room was empty, except for the terrified family and an open window that provided access to the roof. "Where did they go?" Linda Morrison whispered as Brandon helped her and her children to their feet. They were just standing there, and then suddenly they all turned and walked out through the window. Brandon looked out the window and saw that it would indeed be possible for someone to climb from the roof of the house to the large oak tree in the backyard, then down to the ground. But for multiple people to exit that way without making any noise seemed unlikely. "How many were there?" Brandon asked as paramedics arrived to treat David Morrison's injuries. 6 or 7, Linda Morrison replied, her voice still shaking. "Maybe more." They all looked exactly the same. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes and with those horrible smooth faces. They didn't say anything, didn't make any demands. They just stood there and watched us, like they were studying us. The search of the Morrison house and the surrounding neighborhood continued for hours, involving dozens of heisers, K-9 units, and helicopter support. But just like all the previous incidents, no trace of the intruders was ever found. No fingerprints, no DNA evidence, no footprints, nothing to indicate who they were or where they had gone. David Morrison was hospitalized with a severe concussion and multiple lacerations, but he recovered fully within a few weeks. However, his memory of the attack was fragmentary at best. He remembered hearing noise downstairs and going to investigate, then waking up in the hospital. He had no recollection of seeing the faceless intruders that his family described. The Morrison family moved out of their house within a week of the attack, and several other families on Oakwood Drive followed suit over the next month. Property values in the neighborhood plummeted as word of the strange incidents spread through the community, and the area began to develop a reputation for being unsafe and possibly haunted. Brandon continued working his patrol, but he found himself becoming increasingly obsessed with understanding what was happening in his jurisdiction. He spent his off-duty time researching similar cases in other parts of the country, looking for patterns or explanations that might help him make sense of the faceless intruders. What he discovered during his research was deeply disturbing. Over the past 5 years, there had been dozens of reports in rural communities across the Midwest of similar incidents involving groups of faceless individuals conducting surveillance and occasionally attacking families. The reports came from Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, and Illinois, always in small towns or rural areas, always involving the same description of tall, thin figures with smooth, featureless faces. In some cases, the incidents had escalated to the point where entire neighborhoods had been abandoned, with residents fleeing their homes rather than continue living in fear of the mysterious intruders. In other cases, people had simply disappeared. Families who had reported sightings of the faceless figures and then were never seen again. Brandon brought this information to his superiors, but they seemed reluctant to acknowledge that the incidents might be part of a larger pattern. The official position was that the Oakwood Drive cases were isolated incidents involving a local perpetrator who would eventually be caught through traditional police work. But Brandon knew better. He knew that what was happening in Millfield County was part of something much larger and more organized than a single disturbed individual playing pranks on his neighbors. The coordination between the different figures, their ability to appear and disappear without leaving traces, and their apparent immunity to gunfire all suggested that this was a carefully planned operation with resources and capabilities that went far beyond what any local criminal could possess. In September of 2023, exactly 1 year after the first incident at the Hendricks house, Brandon received a call that would change everything. The call came in at 2:17 a.m., and the address was one that made Brandon's heart sink with dread. 1247 Oakwood Drive, the empty house where this nightmare had begun. Unit 23, we have a report of lights and multiple voices inside 1247 Oakwood Drive, dispatch reported. Caller states the activity has been ongoing for several hours and appears to involve a large number of individuals. Brandon acknowledged the call and drove immediately to Oakwood Drive, but this time he didn't call for backup. He had a growing suspicion that the faceless intruders were specifically targeting him, using the empty house as bait to draw him into a confrontation. If that was the case, then bringing other officers into the situation would only put them in danger. As Brandon approached 1247 Oakwood Drive, he could see that the caller's report was accurate. Every light in the house was on, and he could see shadows moving behind every window. Not just one or two figures, but what appeared to be dozens of people moving through the house in complex, choreographed patterns. Brandon parked across the street and observed the house for several minutes, trying to count the number of individuals inside and assess the situation. What he saw defied his ability to process rationally. The figures inside the house weren't just walking around randomly. They were performing some kind of elaborate ritual or ceremony, moving in precise formations that suggested careful planning and coordination. Brandon tried to call for backup, but discovered that his radio was dead, producing nothing but static when he keyed the microphone. His cell phone showed no signal bars, just as it had during that first incident a year earlier. He was completely cut off from communication with the outside world. Brandon sat in his patrol car for several minutes, weighing his options and trying to decide on the best course of action. Every instinct he had developed during 8 years of police work told him to wait for backup, to establish a perimeter, to approach the situation with overwhelming force and proper support. But he also knew that by the time backup arrived, the figures inside the house would have vanished just as they always did, leaving no evidence of their presence except for more worn paths in the floors and more strange symbols carved into the walls. Brandon made a decision that he knew might be the last decision he would ever make. He drew his service weapon, activated his flashlight, and approached the house alone. The front door was standing wide open, just as it had been during every previous incident. As Brandon stepped onto the front porch, he could hear voices from inside the house, not speaking in English, but in some kind of language that sounded both ancient and alien, with syllables and rhythms that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and trigger primitive fears buried deep in his DNA. Brandon paused at the threshold, his flashlight beam cutting through the interior of the house and revealing scenes that challenged his sanity. The living room was filled with dozens of the faceless figures, all of them moving in slow, synchronized patterns while making those strange vocalizations. Some were carrying objects that Brandon couldn't identify. Geometric shapes made of metal or stone that seemed to bend light around them in impossible ways. But the most disturbing thing about the scene was that Brandon recognized some of the figures. Despite their lack of facial features, he could identify them by their height, their build, their way of moving. One of them was wearing what looked like a police uniform, and Brandon realized with growing horror that it was identical to his own uniform, complete with badge and name tag. Another figure was wearing clothes that Brandon recognized as belonging to Jerry Hendricks, and another was dressed like David Morrison. It was as if the faceless intruders had been collecting clothing and identities from their victims, creating perfect copies of the people they had terrorized. Brandon raised his weapon and stepped into the house, his voice cutting through the alien chanting. "Police! Everyone on the ground now. This is your final warning." The figures stopped their ritual movements and turned toward Brandon in perfect unison, dozens of featureless faces oriented in his direction like flowers following the sun. The silence that followed was so complete that Brandon could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Then, one by one, the figures began to move toward him with that same deliberate, measured pace he had become so familiar with. But this time, they weren't moving randomly. They were approaching him from all directions, surrounding him and cutting off any possible escape route. Brandon fired his weapon repeatedly, emptying his magazine into the approaching figures. But just as before, the bullets seemed to have no effect. The figures staggered slightly when hit, but continued advancing without any apparent injury or distress. Brandon reloaded quickly, his hands shaking with adrenaline and fear, but he knew that conventional weapons weren't going to stop these things. He needed to find another way out of the situation, but the figures had already formed a complete circle around him, standing just out of arm's reach and watching him with their terrible, eyeless faces. That's when Brandon heard footsteps on the stairs behind him, and he turned to see more figures descending from the second floor. These were different from the others. They were wearing police uniforms that Brandon recognized as belonging to officers from his own department. Officers Davis, Martinez, Thompson, and others, all with the same smooth, featureless faces as the other intruders. Brandon's radio suddenly crackled to life, filled with voices that sounded like his fellow officers but spoke in that same alien language he had been hearing from the figures in the living room. The voices were calling his name, but they were pronouncing it in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce. As the circle of faceless figures closed in around him, Brandon realized the truth that had been staring him in the face for months. These weren't strangers who had invaded his community. These were people he had known, people he had tried to protect, people who had been taken and transformed into something else entirely. The Hendricks family, the Morrison family, his fellow officers, and dozens of other residents of Millfield County, they had all been collected, studied, and somehow converted into these eyeless, voiceless servants of something that Brandon's mind couldn't comprehend. And now it was his turn. Brandon tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The figures had formed a solid wall of bodies around him, and when he tried to push through them, he found that they were impossibly strong and completely immovable. His flashlight began to flicker and fade, plunging the room into darkness that was filled with the sound of that alien chanting, resuming at a faster, more urgent pace. Brandon's service weapon was torn from his hands by invisible forces, and he felt himself being lifted off the ground by dozens of smooth, cold hands that seemed to be everywhere at once. The chanting grew louder and more complex, and Brandon felt his consciousness beginning to fade as something that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite death overtook him. The last thing Brandon remembered was the sensation of his face beginning to change. The features that had defined his identity for 29 years slowly dissolving and smoothing away until there was nothing left but blank skin stretched over bone. When Sergeant Thompson arrived at 1247 Oakwood Drive the next morning to investigate Brandon's failure to respond to radio calls, he found Brandon's patrol car parked across the street from the empty house, engine still running and driver's door standing open. Brandon's service weapon was lying on the living room floor of the house, and there were signs that someone had been in the building recently. Fresh footprints in the dust and new wear patterns in the hardwood floors. But there was no sign of Officer Brandon Martinez, and despite an extensive search involving multiple agencies and volunteer groups, no trace of him was ever found. The official investigation concluded that Brandon had suffered some kind of mental breakdown related to the stress of the unsolved cases in his patrol area, and that he had abandoned his post and fled the jurisdiction. His personnel file was marked with a notation of absent without leave mental health crisis, and after 6 months with no contact, he was officially terminated from the Millfield County Sheriff's Department. But residents of the areas surrounding Oakwood Drive continued to report sightings of suspicious persons looking in their windows and walking through their yards at night. The descriptions were always the same: tall figures in dark clothing with smooth, featureless faces where their eyes and noses and mouths should have been. And sometimes, witnesses reported, one of the figures was wearing what looked like a police uniform with a name tag that read B. Martinez. The sightings spread beyond Millfield County, appearing in neighboring jurisdictions and then in communities hundreds of miles away. Reports came in from small towns across Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska, always following the same pattern: systematic surveillance of residential neighborhoods, followed by home invasions and the disappearance of entire families. Law enforcement agencies in the affected areas tried to coordinate their investigations, but they found themselves hampered by the same problems that had plagued Brandon's efforts. No physical evidence, no clear motive, and suspects who seemed to be immune to conventional police methods. One by one, the investigating officers assigned to these cases began to disappear. They would respond to calls involving the faceless intruders and simply vanish, leaving behind running patrol cars and unfired weapons. Some departments stopped responding to such calls altogether, classifying them as mental health crises or mass hysteria rather than legitimate criminal activity. But the sightings continued, and the pattern continued to spread, moving steadily westward across the American heartland like some kind of slow-motion invasion that traditional law enforcement was powerless to stop. And in the abandoned houses and empty lots where the faceless figures had been seen, investigators found the same evidence that Brandon had discovered months earlier: worn paths in floors and carpets, strange symbols carved into walls and foundations, and the lingering scent of something metallic and sweet that no one could identify but everyone recognized as the smell of fear made manifest. The last official report filed by the Millfield County Sheriff's Department regarding the Oakwood Drive incidents was dated 6 months after Brandon Martinez's disappearance. It stated simply that all active investigations related to the case had been suspended due to lack of evidence and leads, and that the case files had been transferred to the Illinois State Police for potential federal investigation. But the Illinois State Police never received those files. When investigators from the FBI finally arrived in Millfield County to look into the disappearances, they found that all records related to the Oakwood Drive cases had vanished from the Sheriff's Department database, along with any physical evidence that had been collected. The only remaining trace of Officer Brandon Martinez and his year-long investigation was a single manila folder hidden in the bottom drawer of his desk, containing maps and photographs and witness statements that painted a picture of something so far outside normal human experience that federal investigators weren't sure how to classify it. The folder was eventually sealed and transferred to a classified facility where it joined thousands of other files documenting incidents that couldn't be explained through conventional means. And there it remains today, gathering dust alongside reports of similar cases from across the country, all involving tall, faceless figures conducting surveillance and taking people in the middle of the night, all following the same inexplicable pattern that seems to be spreading across the continent like a slow-moving plague. But sometimes, late at night, law enforcement officers in small towns across the Midwest receive calls about suspicious persons looking in windows. And when they arrive to investigate, they find empty streets and frightened witnesses who describe the same thing that the residents of Oakwood Drive saw all those months ago. And sometimes those officers never come back from those calls, leaving behind patrol cars with engines still running and radios that broadcast nothing but static and voices, speaking in languages that human beings were never meant to understand. Working night patrol in the Riverside Industrial District was supposed to be one of the quieter assignments in the department. Most nights brought nothing more than the occasional homeless person seeking shelter in an abandoned warehouse, teenagers looking for a place to drink beer without parental supervision, or vandals tagging buildings that had already been covered in graffiti dozens of times over. The area had been steadily dying since the economic collapse of 2008, when factory after factory shut down and moved their operations overseas, leaving behind a sprawling concrete wasteland of empty buildings and broken dreams. Officer Kevin Walsh had been working this beat for 2 years and had grown comfortable with its predictable rhythm of minor incidents and long stretches of peaceful solitude. The industrial district covered nearly 8 square miles of abandoned factories, empty warehouses, and crumbling office buildings, most of which had been stripped bare by salvage crews and left to slowly deteriorate under the weight of time and weather. It was the kind of place where the biggest excitement usually came from chasing away teenagers who thought the empty buildings would make good party spots, or dealing with the occasional dispute between homeless camps over territory and resources. That sense of routine familiarity was shattered completely on a humid Thursday night in August 2023, when a call came through dispatch that would transform everything Kevin thought he knew about his quiet patrol area. The call came in at 1:37 a.m., cutting through the usual static and background noise that characterized late-night radio communications with an urgency that immediately put Kevin on alert. Unit 47. We have a report of trespassing and possible vandalism at the old Monarch Electronics building on Industrial Way. Anonymous caller report seeing lights and hearing voices from inside the building. Building has been vacant for over 4 years, according to city records. Kevin acknowledged the call and turned his patrol car toward Industrial Way, driving slowly through the maze of empty streets that connected the various abandoned facilities. The Monarch Electronics building was one of the larger structures in the district, a 4-story brick edifice that had once employed over 200 people in the assembly of circuit boards and electronic components during the boom years of the 1990s. Like most of the buildings in the area, it had been systematically stripped of anything valuable after the company relocated to Mexico, leaving behind only concrete floors, bare walls, and the skeletal remains of industrial infrastructure. As Kevin approached the building, he could immediately see why someone had called to report suspicious activity. There were indeed lights visible through several of the boarded windows on the upper floors, flickering and moving in patterns that suggested multiple people were inside with flashlights or battery-powered lanterns. But more disturbing than the lights was the sound that drifted through the night air as Kevin stepped out of his patrol car to conduct a closer inspection of the property. The sound was voices, many of them, all speaking in unison like some kind of group recitation or chant. The words weren't clear enough to understand from street level, but the rhythm and cadence were unmistakably human, and the coordination suggested a level of organization that went far beyond typical squatter activity or teenage vandalism. Whatever was happening inside the Monarch Electronics building involved a significant number of people who were engaged in some kind of coordinated activity that required them to speak in perfect synchronization. Kevin walked around the perimeter of the building, looking for signs of forced entry and trying to get a better sense of what was happening inside. The main entrance was still secured with heavy chains and multiple padlocks that showed no signs of tampering, and the loading dock doors on the side of the building remained welded shut with steel plates that had been installed when the building was first abandoned. But around the back of the structure, Kevin found what he was looking for. A section of the chain-link fence that surrounded the property had been cut with wire cutters and carefully peeled back to create an opening, just large enough for a person to squeeze through. The rear door of the building had been pried open with a crowbar or similar tool, leaving deep gouges in the steel frame and completely destroying the lock mechanism. But what struck Kevin as unusual was how professionally the break-in had been executed. The damage was minimal and precisely targeted, suggesting that whoever had entered the building possessed both the proper tools and the technical knowledge to defeat the security measures without causing unnecessary destruction or leaving obvious evidence of their presence. As Kevin approached the damaged rear door, the voices from inside became much clearer and infinitely more disturbing. What he was hearing wasn't just random conversation or even organized discussion. It was some kind of ritualistic recitation where dozens of people were speaking the same words simultaneously in perfect coordination. The effect was deeply unsettling, like listening to a recording of a church service or a political rally where the audio had been distorted or manipulated to create an otherworldly quality that human voices weren't meant to produce. Kevin radioed for backup before entering the building, knowing that whatever was happening inside involved far more people than he could safely handle alone. Unit 47 to dispatch. I'm going to need additional units at the Monarch Electronics building on Industrial Way. I have confirmed trespassing by multiple subjects, and the situation appears to require more than one officer to resolve safely. Copy Unit 47. Backup is en route. ETA approximately 15 minutes. Kevin decided to wait for assistance before entering the building, but he continued to monitor the situation from outside, trying to gather as much information as possible about what was happening within the structure. The chanting continued without interruption, and Kevin began to notice patterns in the rhythm and timing that suggested the speakers were following some kind of script or prepared text rather than engaging in spontaneous religious or political expression. But the most disturbing aspect of what Kevin was hearing was the gradual realization that some of the voices sounded familiar. Mixed in with the coordinated recitation were individual voices that he recognized as belonging to people he knew from the community. Local residents, business owners, and even fellow police officers who were supposed to be working other assignments that night. When backup finally arrived in the form of Officer Sarah McNeil, a 5-year veteran who had extensive experience with the industrial district, Kevin briefed her on what he had observed and the concerns that had been developing during his surveillance of the building. "I'm telling you, Sarah, some of those voices belong to people we know," Kevin explained as they prepared to enter the building together. "I heard what sounded like Deputy Chief Harrison, and I'm pretty sure I recognize the voice of that dispatcher, Michelle Torres, who's supposed to be working the desk tonight." Sarah listened carefully to the sounds coming from inside the building, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she began to recognize some of the same voices that Kevin had identified. "You're right, that definitely sounds like Harrison. but he's supposed to be at home tonight. He specifically told everyone he was taking a personal day to deal with some family issues. And Torres is definitely working dispatch tonight because I talked to her less than an hour ago when I called in that traffic stop on River Road. So either we're hearing some kind of recording, or there's something seriously wrong with what's happening inside that building. The two officers entered the building through the damaged rear door, their flashlights cutting through the darkness and revealing an interior that had been stripped bare of everything except concrete floors and structural support columns. The ground floor was a vast open space where assembly lines had once operated, now empty except for scattered debris left behind by previous intruders, and the occasional evidence of homeless encampments that had been established and abandoned over the years. The chanting they had heard from outside was definitely coming from somewhere above them, and Kevin and Sarah made their way carefully toward a metal staircase that provided access to the upper floors. As they climbed, the voices became louder and more distinct, and both officers became increasingly certain that they were hearing people they knew personally engaged in some kind of group activity that neither of them could explain or understand. The second floor had once housed administrative offices and was divided into a maze of small rooms and cubicles created by removable wall partitions. But every room they checked was empty, with undisturbed dust on the floors and no evidence that anyone had been there recently. The voices were clearly coming from somewhere above them, but the complete absence of any signs of occupation on the second floor was puzzling and unsettling. Moving to the third floor revealed a dramatically different situation that immediately explained where the voices were coming from and why the building had attracted so much attention from whoever had made the anonymous call to police. The entire third floor had been converted into a single, large room by the removal of all interior partitions and walls. The space was filled with people, dozens of them, maybe 60 or 70 individuals arranged in concentric circles around a central platform that had been constructed from wooden crates and plywood sheets. Every person in the room was facing toward the platform and speaking in unison, reciting what appeared to be a prepared text that they all knew by heart. But the most disturbing aspect of the scene wasn't the number of people or their coordinated recitation. It was their identities. Kevin and Sarah immediately recognized many of the participants as residents of Riverside, including police officers, city officials, business owners, and ordinary citizens who had no obvious connection to each other or reason to be gathered in an abandoned building in the middle of the night. Even more troubling was the fact that several of the people they could see were supposed to be elsewhere at that exact moment. Deputy Chief Harrison was indeed present, despite having claimed to be dealing with family issues at home. Dispatcher Michelle Torres was there as well, even though she was supposedly working the night shift at police headquarters. There were patrol officers who were scheduled to be working other beats, city council members who lived in different parts of town, and local business owners who had no apparent reason to be involved in whatever activity was taking place. Kevin and Sarah positioned themselves behind one of the structural support columns where they could observe the gathering without being seen, trying to understand what was happening and determine the best course of action. The recitation that all the participants were engaged in appeared to be some kind of list or inventory, with each person speaking identical words in perfect synchronization. As Kevin listened more carefully, he began to make out individual words and phrases that made his blood run cold. The participants were reciting detailed personal information about families throughout Riverside: full names, home addresses, work schedules, children's school assignments, and intimate details about daily routines and personal habits that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance and investigation. But the information being recited wasn't random or general. It was specifically focused on families that had been reported missing over the past several months. The Hendricks family, who had supposedly moved to another state for employment reasons. The Morrison family, who had allegedly relocated to be closer to elderly relatives. The Patterson family, whose disappearance had been explained as a sudden decision to pursue educational opportunities in a different region. Each family that was mentioned in the recitation had vanished from Riverside under circumstances that had seemed unusual at the time, but had been explained away with plausible cover stories that discouraged further investigation. But hearing their personal information being recited in this bizarre ritual context suggested that their disappearances hadn't been voluntary relocations at all. Sarah grabbed Kevin's arm and pointed toward the platform at the center of the room, where a figure had emerged from the shadows and was apparently directing the recitation. The figure was wearing dark clothing and appeared to be reading from a thick notebook or manual, occasionally gesturing to different sections of the gathered participants as if conducting an orchestra or leading a choir. But when the figure turned slightly and his face became visible in the dim light, both Kevin and Sarah felt their hearts stop. The person leading the ritual was Police Chief Robert Daniels, the head of the Riverside Police Department, and a 30-year veteran of law enforcement who was widely respected throughout the community. Chief Daniels was supposed to be attending a law enforcement conference in the state capitol, a 3-day event that would keep him away from Riverside until the weekend. His presence at this gathering, combined with his apparent leadership role in whatever activity was taking place, suggested that the situation was far more serious and complex than either Kevin or Sarah had initially realized. As they watched, Chief Daniels raised his hand to signal a pause in the recitation, then opened his notebook to a different section and began reading new instructions to the assembled participants. The content of what he was reading made Kevin's skin crawl and caused Sarah to grip her service weapon more tightly. The Anderson family on Maple Street follows a consistent schedule, Chief Daniels read in a clear, authoritative voice that carried throughout the room. Father leaves for work at 7:15 a.m. every weekday. Mother takes children to school at 8 a.m. and returns home by 8:30 a.m. House is unoccupied from 8:30 a.m. to 3:45 p.m. on school days. Children return home at 4 p.m. and remain until father returns at approximately 6:30 p.m. The assembled participants listened intently to these instructions, with some of them taking notes in small notebooks that they had brought with them. Chief Daniels continued reading similar information about other families throughout Riverside, providing detailed schedules, personal habits, and vulnerability assessments that could only have been compiled through months of systematic surveillance. The Martinez family has a teenage daughter who frequently stays out past curfew on weekend nights, Chief Daniels continued. Parents are heavy sleepers and typically don't wake when she returns home late. The family dog is kept in the backyard and is easily distracted with food. The back door lock can be defeated with minimal noise using standard entry tools. Kevin and Sarah exchanged horrified glances as they realized what they were witnessing. This wasn't just some bizarre cult gathering or unusual community meeting. It was a planning session for a coordinated campaign of home invasions, kidnappings, or worse. The missing families that had been mentioned earlier in the recitation hadn't relocated voluntarily. They had been targeted, studied, and taken by the same group that was now planning similar actions against other Riverside residents. But the most terrifying aspect of the situation was the involvement of law enforcement personnel and city officials in the planning process. Chief Daniels wasn't just a participant in whatever criminal enterprise was being organized. He was clearly one of its leaders. And the presence of other police officers, dispatchers, and local government officials suggested that the conspiracy extended throughout the power structure of Riverside. Sarah began to slowly back away from their observation position, intending to retreat from the building and call for outside assistance from state or federal law enforcement agencies. But as she moved, her foot struck a piece of debris on the floor, creating a small but audible sound that echoed through the large room. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Every person in the room stopped speaking simultaneously and turned toward the location where Kevin and Sarah were hiding. The silence that followed was complete and oppressive. broken only by the sound of dozens of people breathing in perfect synchronization. Chief Daniels stepped down from the platform and began walking slowly toward their hiding place, his notebook still open in his hands, and his expression completely calm and emotionless. "Officers Walsh and McNeil," he said in the same authoritative voice he had been using to address the group. "Please step out from behind that column and join us. Your presence here was anticipated, and we have prepared specific roles for you in tonight's activities." Kevin and Sarah drew their service weapons and remained behind the column, but they both knew that their position was hopeless. They were outnumbered by at least 30 to 1, surrounded by people who had clearly been planning for this confrontation, and cut off from any means of calling for outside assistance. "Chief Daniels," Kevin called out, his voice echoing strangely in the large room. "We're going to need you and everyone else in this building to move slowly toward the exits with your hands visible. This gathering appears to violate several city ordinances and potentially state laws regarding criminal conspiracy." The response to Kevin's official police command was laughter, not from Chief Daniels, but from every other person in the room simultaneously. The sound was inhuman and deeply disturbing, like listening to a recording of laughter that had been artificially synchronized and amplified. "Officers Walsh and McNeil," Chief Daniels said with the same calm authority, "you have been selected for integration into our community improvement program based on your psychological profiles, professional skills, and potential for adaptation to new operational parameters. Resistance to the integration process will only delay the inevitable and may result in complications that we would prefer to avoid." Sarah keyed her radio, hoping to contact dispatch and request emergency backup, but discovered that her radio was producing nothing but static. Kevin tried his radio as well, with the same result. Whatever was happening in the building was somehow interfering with radio communications, or the signals were being deliberately jammed. "Your communication equipment will not function within this facility," Chief Daniels explained, apparently having anticipated their attempts to call for help. "The building has been modified with signal blocking technology to ensure that our activities are not interrupted by outside interference." Kevin and Sarah were trapped in the building with dozens of people who were clearly engaged in criminal conspiracy, led by their own police chief, with no way to communicate with the outside world or call for assistance. Their only options were surrender or attempting to fight their way out through overwhelming opposition. "What happened to the missing families?" Sarah called out, hoping to gather information that might be useful if they somehow managed to escape and report what they had discovered. "Where are the Hendricks, the Morrisons, and the Pattersons? What did you do to them?" "The families you mention have been relocated to facilities where they can contribute more effectively to community goals," Chief Daniels replied. "They are safe and well cared for, and they have adapted successfully to their new circumstances. You will have the opportunity to see them soon, as you will be joining them in the same program." The assembled participants began to move slowly toward Kevin and Sarah's position, not running or rushing, but advancing with the same mechanical coordination that had characterized their earlier recitation. They moved like people who were following predetermined instructions rather than making individual decisions, and their faces showed no emotion or personality, just blank determination to complete whatever task they had been assigned. Kevin and Sarah positioned themselves back to back behind the column, weapons drawn and ready to defend themselves, but they both knew that their ammunition was limited, and they would eventually be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Their only hope was to try to reach the staircase and fight their way to an exit before they were completely surrounded. "On 3, we make a run for the stairs," Kevin whispered to Sarah. "Stay low, move fast, and don't stop to engage unless you have to." But before they could execute their escape attempt, the lights in the room suddenly went out completely, plunging the entire floor into absolute darkness. The assembled participants continued their advance, apparently unaffected by the loss of visibility, while Kevin and Sarah found themselves effectively blinded and disoriented. In the darkness, Kevin could hear footsteps approaching from all directions, moving with the same coordinated precision that had characterized everything else about this gathering. Flashlight beams began dancing through the darkness as some of the participants activated portable lights, but the beams were directed away from Kevin and Sarah's position, apparently to maintain their tactical disadvantage. Officers Walsh and McNeil, Chief Daniel's voice came from somewhere in the darkness. Please place your weapons on the floor and move toward the sound of my voice. The integration process works most effectively when subjects are cooperative and relaxed. Instead of complying, Kevin and Sarah used their own flashlights to navigate toward where they remembered the staircase being located, moving as quickly as possible while trying to avoid the advancing participants. But in the darkness and confusion, they became separated, with Sarah moving toward what she thought was the staircase, while Kevin found himself cornered against one of the walls. Kevin tried to use his flashlight to locate Sarah, but the beam was immediately answered by multiple flashlight beams from the participants, creating a disorienting pattern of crossing lights that made it impossible to see clearly or navigate effectively. He could hear Sarah calling his name from somewhere across the room, but her voice seemed to be moving farther away, suggesting that she was either finding her way toward an exit or being herded in a different direction by the advancing participants. Officer Walsh, Chief Daniel's voice came from directly behind Kevin, so close that he could feel breath on his neck. Your partner has already been secured and is beginning the integration process. You can join her voluntarily, or we can use methods that are more persuasive. Kevin spun around with his weapon ready, but his flashlight beam revealed nothing but empty space where Chief Daniel's voice had seemed to come from. The psychological warfare was as sophisticated as everything else about this operation. Whoever was running it understood how to use darkness, sound, and disorientation to break down resistance and create compliance. From somewhere across the room, Kevin heard Sarah scream, not in pain, but in surprise or fear. The sound was cut off abruptly, suggesting that she had been captured or incapacitated by some of the participants. Kevin was now completely alone in a room full of hostile subjects, with no backup, no communication with the outside world, and no clear understanding of what he was facing. Kevin decided that his only chance was to abandon any attempt at official police procedure and focus entirely on survival and escape. He turned off his flashlight to avoid giving away his position, then began moving as quietly as possible toward where he remembered the staircase being located, using the wall as a guide and trying to avoid the areas where he could hear footsteps and voices. But the participants seemed to have perfect knowledge of the building's layout and were able to coordinate their movements even in complete darkness. Every direction Kevin tried to move, he encountered people who were blocking his path or herding him toward areas where he would be more easily captured. Officer Walsh. Chief Daniel's voice came from a different location now, apparently following Kevin's movements through the darkness. The integration process is not optional. It will occur whether you cooperate or not. Your choice is simply whether it occurs under comfortable circumstances or through methods that you will find much less pleasant. Kevin realized that he was being driven toward a specific location in the room where capture would be easier, or where specialized equipment might be available for whatever integration process Chief Daniels kept referring to. Instead of continuing to try to reach the staircase, Kevin decided to break the pattern by moving in an unexpected direction, even if it meant moving deeper into the room rather than toward an exit. Using his knowledge of the building's structure, Kevin moved toward where he remembered seeing windows during their initial observation of the room. If he could reach one of the windows, he might be able to break through the boarding and escape to the fire escape system that connected the building to adjacent structures. But as Kevin moved toward the exterior wall, his flashlight beam accidentally swept across something that made him freeze in terror. Arranged along the wall were dozens of personal items that obviously belonged to the missing families. Children's toys, family photographs, pieces of jewelry, and clothing items that were carefully organized and labeled like exhibits in a museum. The items weren't just random possessions that might have been left behind when families moved away. These were personal treasures and sentimental objects that people would never voluntarily abandon. A child's favorite stuffed animal, a wedding ring, family photos from special occasions, and handmade items that represented years of emotional investment. But more disturbing than the presence of these personal items was their condition. Everything was carefully cleaned, organized, and displayed as if it were part of some kind of memorial or trophy collection. Each item was labeled with a small tag that identified the original owner and the date it had been acquired. Kevin examined some of the labels more closely and felt his blood turn to ice. The dates on the tags corresponded exactly with the dates when various families had been reported missing from Riverside. The possessions of the Hendricks family were dated 3 months earlier, the Morrison family items were dated 6 weeks earlier, and the Patterson family belongings were dated just 2 weeks previously. This wasn't evidence that the families had been relocated to new homes or had voluntarily moved away for employment opportunities. This was evidence that they had been systematically murdered, and their personal possessions had been kept as trophies by whoever was responsible for their disappearances. Kevin's discovery was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching his position, and he realized that his use of the flashlight to examine the trophy collection had given away his location to the participants who were hunting him through the darkness. Multiple flashlight beams were now converging on his position, and he could hear Chief Daniels' voice directing the search with military precision. "Target is at the northwest corner of the room near the memorial display," Chief Daniels announced. "Approach vectors Alpha and Beta, close formation, non-lethal containment protocols." Kevin had no choice but to abandon stealth and make a desperate run for the staircase, using his flashlight to navigate while moving as quickly as possible through the obstacles and debris scattered across the floor. Behind him, he could hear the participants coordinating their pursuit, calling out position updates and tactical instructions in the same emotionless voices they had used during their earlier recitation. Kevin reached the staircase and began descending toward the second floor, hoping to reach the building's exits before he was overtaken by his pursuers. But as he reached the second floor landing, he discovered that additional participants were already waiting for him, positioned to block his escape routes and force him back toward the upper floors. The trap was more sophisticated than Kevin had realized. The entire building had been prepared for this confrontation, with participants stationed at strategic locations to prevent escape and equipment positioned to facilitate whatever capture and processing procedures they intended to use. Kevin fought his way through the participants on the second floor, using his training and equipment advantages to overcome individual opponents, but there were simply too many of them to defeat through conventional tactics. For every person he managed to get past, 2 more appeared to block his progress or attack him from unexpected directions. The fighting was intense but strangely one-sided. The participants were clearly trying to capture Kevin alive rather than seriously injure or kill him, which gave him some tactical advantages but also suggested that whatever they had planned for him would be much worse than simple murder. Kevin managed to reach the ground floor, but found that the rear door they had originally used to enter the building had been barricaded from the outside, trapping him inside the structure with no obvious escape routes. The front entrance was still secured with chains and padlocks that would require considerable time and effort to defeat. Time that he didn't have with dozens of hostile subjects pursuing him through the building. Kevin's radio suddenly crackled to life, surprising him because all previous attempts at communication had been blocked. Unit 47, this is dispatch. What's your current status? We've lost contact with you in Unit 23 for over an hour. Kevin keyed his radio, hoping that the communication blackout had been lifted, and that he could finally call for the backup and assistance he desperately needed. Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I need immediate emergency backup at the Monarch Electronics building on Industrial Way. Multiple hostile subjects, officer in distress, and evidence of serious criminal activity. Request immediate response from all available units. Copy Unit 47, backup is en route. ETA approximately 5 minutes. Kevin felt a wave of relief, but it was immediately followed by suspicion. The radio communication was clear and strong, completely different from the blocked signals he had experienced earlier. Either the signal blocking equipment had been deactivated, or he was hearing exactly what someone wanted him to hear. The suspicion proved justified when the voice of Chief Daniels came through Kevin's radio, using the same calm, authoritative tone he had employed throughout the night. Officer Walsh, the communication you just heard was generated by our equipment to provide you with false hope and encourage you to remain in the building. No backup is coming because no backup was actually requested. Kevin realized that his radio had been compromised somehow, possibly reprogrammed to receive fake transmissions that would manipulate his behavior and decision-making. The sophisticated technology and coordination that characterized everything about this operation extended even to psychological warfare and electronic deception. But while Kevin was dealing with the revelation that his communications were being manipulated, he heard something that gave him genuine hope for the first time since entering the building. Outside, the sound of approaching sirens was becoming audible, suggesting that real backup was finally arriving, whether he had successfully requested it or not. The participants who had been pursuing Kevin through the building seemed to hear the sirens as well, because their coordinated advance suddenly faltered and became disorganized. Kevin could hear Chief Daniels issuing rapid instructions through some kind of internal communication system, apparently implementing contingency plans for dealing with outside interference. All participants implement Protocol 7 immediately, Chief Daniels' voice echoed through the building. Evidence disposal and facility sterilization to commence in 60 seconds. All personnel to evacuation positions. Kevin didn't understand what Protocol 7 entailed, but the urgency in Chief Daniels' voice suggested that it involved destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses to prevent the outside authorities from discovering what had been happening in the building. The approaching sirens were definitely getting closer, and Kevin could now see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles through the boarded windows of the ground floor. But instead of feeling relief, he was filled with growing dread about what the participants might do to cover up their activities before the backup units could intervene. Kevin's fears were confirmed when he heard the sound of multiple small explosions from the upper floors of the building, followed by the smell of smoke and chemical accelerants. The participants were systematically destroying evidence and possibly preparing to burn down the entire structure to eliminate any trace of what had occurred. But the most horrifying realization came when Kevin remembered that Sarah was still somewhere in the building, possibly injured or unconscious, and would be killed in any fire or explosion that was intended to destroy evidence. Kevin abandoned his own escape attempts and began fighting his way back through the building, searching for Sarah and trying to locate her before the structure became completely engulfed in flames. The smoke was getting thicker rapidly, and Kevin could hear the sound of more explosions from different parts of the building as the participants continued their systematic destruction of evidence. Using his flashlight and following the sound of voices, Kevin made his way back toward the third floor where he had last heard Sarah scream. The third floor was now filled with smoke and illuminated by multiple small fires that had been set throughout the room. The memorial display of personal items belonging to missing families was already burning, destroying evidence that could have been used to prosecute whoever was responsible for their disappearances. But in the far corner of the room, Kevin found Sarah unconscious but alive, apparently having been knocked out during her capture rather than seriously injured. Kevin was able to carry her toward the staircase, but their escape was complicated by the fact that the participants had set fires throughout the building to prevent anyone from reaching the exits alive. Kevin and Sarah reached the ground floor just as the backup units were breaking through the front entrance of the building. The officers who came to their rescue were genuine law enforcement personnel from neighboring jurisdictions, not the compromised Riverside officers who had been participating in the conspiracy. The fire department arrived simultaneously and was able to suppress the fires before the entire building was destroyed. But most of the evidence that Kevin and Sarah had observed was lost to the flames and smoke damage. The trophy collection of personal items belonging to missing families was completely destroyed, along with any documents or materials that might have revealed the scope and objectives of the conspiracy. Chief Daniels and the other participants had vanished completely during the confusion of the fire and rescue operations. A thorough search of the building and surrounding area revealed no trace of them, and subsequent investigations found that many of the people Kevin and Sarah had recognized during the gathering had alibis placing them in other locations at the time of the incident. Sarah recovered from her injuries, but retained no memory of what had happened to her after she was separated from Kevin in the darkness. Medical examinations revealed no signs of drugging or other physical causes for her memory loss, but she consistently reported that the last thing she remembered was hearing Kevin call her name in the third-floor room. The official investigation into the incident concluded that Kevin and Sarah had encountered a group of homeless individuals who had been using the abandoned building as a shelter and had accidentally started a fire while trying to cook food or stay warm. The personal items that Kevin reported seeing were dismissed as belongings that the homeless individuals had scavenged from various sources, and the coordinated behavior he described was attributed to stress and confusion in a dangerous situation. Kevin's reports about the involvement of Chief Daniels and other police personnel were investigated, but all of the accused individuals had solid alibis, and no evidence could be found to support the allegations. The investigators concluded that Kevin had misidentified the participants due to poor lighting conditions and the stress of being trapped in a dangerous situation. Chief Daniels expressed understanding and support for Kevin's confusion, attributing the false accusations to the psychological trauma of being trapped in a burning building and witnessing what appeared to be criminal activity. He recommended that Kevin receive counseling and psychological evaluation to help him process the traumatic experience and distinguish between reality and stress-induced hallucinations. But Kevin knew what he had seen and heard, even if he couldn't prove it to the satisfaction of official investigators. The conspiracy he had discovered was real. The missing families had been murdered rather than relocated, and the evidence had been systematically destroyed to prevent exposure of the criminal organization that was operating within Riverside's power structure. Over the following months, Kevin noticed subtle changes in the behavior of people throughout the community that confirmed his worst fears about the extent of the conspiracy. Colleagues, neighbors, and local officials began acting differently, more formal, less emotional, as if they were following scripts rather than expressing genuine thoughts and feelings. Conversations became predictable and mechanical, with people saying what was expected rather than sharing authentic opinions or experiences. Community meetings and social gatherings took on an artificial quality, as if everyone was performing predetermined roles rather than participating naturally in civic activities. Most disturbing of all, the missing persons cases that had been connected to the memorial display in the Monarch Electronics building were quietly closed without explanation. Official records were modified to show that the families had successfully relocated to other states, and any evidence suggesting that investigations had been conducted into their disappearances was removed from police files. Kevin found himself increasingly isolated within his own department as colleagues and supervisors gradually distanced themselves from him and discouraged him from pursuing any follow-up investigations related to the incident. His reports and concerns were dismissed or ignored, and his requests for transfer to different assignments were denied for various administrative reasons. Eventually, Kevin realized that he was being systematically marginalized and discredited to prevent him from exposing whatever criminal organization was operating within Riverside's government and law enforcement structures. Rather than continue fighting a battle he couldn't win, Kevin quietly resigned from the police department and moved to a different state where he hoped to rebuild his career and life. But even after leaving Riverside, Kevin continued to monitor news reports and missing persons cases from his former community. What he observed confirmed that the pattern of family disappearances and evidence destruction was continuing, with new cases emerging regularly and being resolved through the same administrative cover-ups that had characterized the earlier incidents. Kevin also began noticing similar patterns in other communities throughout the region. Small towns where missing persons cases were resolved with implausible explanations, where local government operated with unusual efficiency and coordination, and where residents were consistently described as polite, cooperative, and emotionally controlled. The conspiracy that Kevin had discovered in Riverside wasn't limited to a single community. It was part of a larger pattern of infiltration and control that was spreading systematically through rural areas, transforming normal American towns into something artificial and inhuman. But attempts to interest outside law enforcement agencies in investigating these patterns were unsuccessful. Federal authorities showed no interest in cases that appeared to involve local jurisdictional issues, and state police agencies were reluctant to interfere with matters that local authorities claimed to be handling appropriately. Kevin was left with the knowledge that entire communities were being consumed by an organization he couldn't identify or understand, and that anyone who tried to investigate or resist the process was neutralized through methods that left no evidence of criminal activity. Years later, Kevin sometimes drives through small towns in different parts of the country, paying attention to the subtle signs that indicate whether a community has been affected by the same process he witnessed in Riverside. The signs are always the same: missing persons cases with implausible explanations, local government that operates with mechanical efficiency, and residents who interact in ways that seem artificial and scripted. Most of these communities appear completely normal to casual observers, with low crime rates, efficient services, and citizens who are consistently described as model residents. But to someone who knows what to look for, the absence of genuine human emotion and spontaneity is obvious and deeply disturbing. Kevin has learned to avoid these affected communities and to move on quickly when he encounters them during his travels. He's also learned that trying to warn others about what he's observed is counterproductive, because the stories sound too incredible to be believed and the evidence is too subtle to be convincing. But the nightmares never stopped. Every night, Kevin wakes up in a cold sweat, hearing those voices reciting personal information about families who were marked for disappearance. He hears Chief Daniels reading surveillance reports with clinical detachment, describing vulnerable moments in people's lives as if they were military targets to be eliminated. And he remembers the trophy collection, those carefully preserved remnants of destroyed families, organized and labeled like specimens in some twisted museum of human suffering. The worst part is knowing that somewhere, in buildings that look abandoned but aren't, the process continues. Families are being watched, studied, and eventually taken, their possessions added to collections that serve as monuments to privacy violated and lives erased. And the people responsible are protected by positions of authority that make them immune to investigation or prosecution. 2 years after leaving Riverside, Kevin received a phone call that brought all his fears rushing back with renewed intensity. The caller identified himself as Detective Marcus Thompson from the Ohio State Police, and he was calling about a case that had disturbing similarities to what Kevin had experienced in Riverside. Officer Walsh, I got your contact information from a colleague who remembered your reports about unusual missing persons cases and suspected law enforcement corruption in Riverside, Detective Thompson explained during their initial conversation. We're dealing with something similar here in Millbrook, Ohio, and I was hoping you might be able to provide some insight into patterns we should be looking for. Millbrook was a small town about 300 miles east of Riverside, with a population of roughly 8,000 people, and an economy based primarily on agriculture and small manufacturing. According to Detective Thompson, the town had been experiencing an unusual number of missing persons cases over the past year, all involving families who had supposedly relocated for employment or personal reasons. The cases individually seem legitimate, Thompson continued. But when you look at them collectively, the pattern is disturbing. 12 families in 10 months, all leaving under similar circumstances, all with explanations that sound plausible, but can't be verified through follow-up investigation. Kevin felt his stomach tighten as Detective Thompson described the details of the Millbrook cases. The pattern was identical to what he had observed in Riverside. Families disappearing without trace, official explanations that discouraged further investigation, and local authorities who seemed uninterested in pursuing cases that should have been obvious red flags for suspicious activity. Have you noticed any changes in the behavior of local government officials or law enforcement personnel? Kevin asked, dreading the answer but needing to know if the corruption he had witnessed was spreading to other communities. That's actually why I'm calling you, Thompson replied grimly. 3 weeks ago, we had a state police investigator go missing while conducting surveillance on some of the abandoned buildings in Millbrook's industrial district. He was following up on reports of lights and voices in buildings that were supposed to be empty. Kevin's blood ran cold. The pattern was repeating itself exactly, down to the specific circumstances that had led to his own discovery of the conspiracy in Riverside. Someone was using the same methods to infiltrate and control multiple communities, and the law enforcement personnel who got too close to the truth were being eliminated. Detective Thompson, I need you to listen to me very carefully, Kevin said, his voice urgent with the weight of terrible knowledge. Whatever you're dealing with in Millbrook isn't just a criminal organization or typical corruption case. It's something much larger and more dangerous than anything you've probably encountered in normal police work. Kevin spent the next hour briefing Detective Thompson on everything he had observed in Riverside, including the sophisticated surveillance operations, the involvement of high-ranking officials, and the systematic elimination of evidence that made investigation nearly impossible. Thompson listened carefully, asking detailed questions that demonstrated both his professional skepticism and his growing recognition that the patterns Kevin described matched what he was seeing in Millbrook. The missing state investigator, Officer James Rodriguez, was working alone on the surveillance assignment because we wanted to keep the investigation quiet until we had more concrete evidence, Thompson explained. His last radio contact was from an abandoned textile plant on the outskirts of town, where he reported seeing lights and hearing what sounded like a large group of people engaged in some kind of meeting. Kevin felt ice water run through his veins. The circumstances of Officer Rodriguez's disappearance were virtually identical to what had happened to him and Sarah in Riverside, except that Rodriguez had apparently been working alone and hadn't had backup available when the situation turned dangerous. Detective Thompson, you need to understand that whoever is behind these operations has extensive resources, sophisticated surveillance capabilities, and the ability to compromise law enforcement personnel at the highest levels, Kevin warned. If Officer Rodriguez discovered what I think he discovered, then he's either dead or he's been subjected to whatever process they use to convert people into participants in their conspiracy. "What kind of process are you talking about?" Thompson asked, his voice reflecting growing concern about the implications of what Kevin was describing. Kevin hesitated before answering, knowing that what he was about to say would sound like science fiction or paranoid fantasy, but also knowing that Thompson needed to understand the full scope of what they were facing. "I don't know exactly how they do it, but they have methods for changing people's personalities and behavior patterns," Kevin explained carefully. "People who get too close to their operations either disappear completely, or they return with altered personalities that make them into willing participants in the conspiracy. It's like they can reprogram people to serve their objectives while maintaining the appearance of normal behavior." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, apparently processing the implications of what Kevin had told him. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a note of fear that hadn't been present earlier in the conversation. "Officer Walsh, I think I may have made a serious mistake in judgment," Thompson said slowly. "After Rodriguez went missing, I briefed my supervisor on what we had discovered and requested additional resources for a larger investigation. But instead of authorizing more personnel, he told me to scale back the investigation and focus on other priorities." "Who is your supervisor?" Kevin asked, though he was already beginning to suspect what the answer would be. "Captain William Morrison, a 25-year veteran who transferred to our district from Riverside, Illinois, about 6 months ago." Kevin felt his world collapse around him as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The organization wasn't just infiltrating individual communities. It was systematically placing compromised personnel in key positions throughout multiple law enforcement agencies, creating a network of control that extended across state lines and jurisdictional boundaries. Captain Morrison was almost certainly the same Morrison who had been involved in the conspiracy in Riverside, now positioned to monitor and control investigations in Ohio that might threaten the organization's operations. Detective Thompson had unknowingly reported his discoveries to someone who was working for the very people he was trying to investigate. "Detective Thompson, you need to get out of your current location immediately," Kevin said urgently. "Don't go back to your office. Don't contact anyone else in your department, and don't trust any communications that claim to be from official sources. The people you're investigating now know exactly what you've discovered, and they're probably already implementing plans to neutralize you." "Are you serious? You're telling me that my own captain is involved in some kind of conspiracy to cover up mass disappearances?" "I'm telling you that the conspiracy I discovered in Riverside has apparently spread to your area, and that anyone in a position to investigate or expose it becomes a target for elimination," Kevin replied. "Officer Rodriguez is probably dead, and you're next on their list unless you take immediate action to protect yourself." Thompson's voice became tight with stress and fear. "What kind of action? If my own department is compromised, who can I trust? Where can I go for help?" Kevin wished he had better answers, but his own experience had taught him that traditional law enforcement channels were useless against an organization that had infiltrated those very systems. "The first priority is staying alive long enough to gather evidence that can be presented to federal authorities who aren't connected to local law enforcement," Kevin advised. "But you need to assume that your current location is under surveillance and that your communications are being monitored." "I'm calling from a payphone outside a gas station about 20 miles from Millbrook," Thompson said. "I started getting paranoid about my office phone and cell phone after our conversation began, so I drove out here to continue talking without being overheard." Kevin was relieved that Thompson had shown good tactical instincts, but he knew that temporary security measures wouldn't be sufficient against an organization with the resources and capabilities he had observed in Riverside. That's good thinking, but you need to assume that your movements are being tracked through your vehicle's GPS system, your credit cards, and any other electronic devices you're carrying," Kevin warned. "These people have access to surveillance technology that goes far beyond what typical criminal organizations can obtain." Over the next hour, Kevin provided Detective Thompson with detailed advice about how to avoid surveillance, gather evidence safely, and make contact with federal agencies that might be willing to investigate a multi-state conspiracy. But even as he shared this information, Kevin was painfully aware that the odds of Thompson surviving long enough to expose the organization were minimal. The conspiracy had proven itself capable of neutralizing law enforcement personnel at will, destroying evidence before it could be analyzed, and maintaining cover stories that prevented outside agencies from taking the allegations seriously. Thompson might be able to stay ahead of them for a few days or weeks, but eventually they would find him and eliminate him, just as they had eliminated Officer Rodriguez and countless others. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the gas station where Thompson was making his call. "Kevin, I see several unmarked cars pulling into the parking lot," Thompson said, his voice filled with sudden alarm. "They're not local police vehicles, and they're positioning themselves to block the exits." "Get out of there now," Kevin said urgently. "Leave your vehicle, avoid main roads, and don't trust anyone who claims to be there to help you." The phone line went dead. Kevin never heard from Detective Thompson again, despite his attempts to contact him through various means over the following weeks. Inquiries to the Ohio State Police were met with official statements that Detective Thompson had taken an extended leave of absence for personal reasons and could not be reached for comment. But Kevin's research into the Millbrook situation revealed that the pattern of missing families had stopped abruptly around the time of Thompson's disappearance, suggesting that the organization had completed whatever objectives they had been pursuing in that community and had moved on to other targets. Kevin also discovered that Captain Morrison had been transferred to another state police district, where he was now in a position to monitor and control investigations in a different geographic area. The pattern was clear. Compromised personnel were being systematically placed in key positions throughout multiple law enforcement agencies, creating a network of control that could suppress investigations and eliminate threats before they became serious problems. The implications were staggering. If the organization Kevin had encountered in Riverside was operating on a national scale, with the ability to infiltrate law enforcement agencies and place their people in positions of authority, then they represented a threat to the basic foundations of American society and government. But Kevin also realized that he was completely powerless to stop them, or even to expose them effectively. Any evidence he might gather would be dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of a former police officer who had suffered psychological trauma, and any law enforcement personnel he contacted might already be compromised or might become targets for elimination. Kevin was forced to accept the terrible reality that an unknown organization was systematically infiltrating and controlling American communities, eliminating families and replacing them with people who served hidden objectives, and that this process was being protected and facilitated by corrupted elements within law enforcement and government. The scope of the conspiracy was too vast to comprehend fully, and its methods were too sophisticated to counter through conventional means. All Kevin could do was protect himself by staying far away from affected communities, and hope that someday someone with more resources and authority would recognize the pattern and take action to stop it. But as years passed, Kevin's hope for outside intervention faded as he observed the conspiracy continuing to spread unchecked through rural communities across the country. The pattern was always the same: missing families, compromised local authorities, and evidence destruction that prevented serious investigation. Kevin began to suspect that the organization's ultimate objective wasn't just the control of individual communities, but the gradual transformation of American society itself. By systematically replacing normal families with programmed individuals and by placing their people in positions of authority throughout law enforcement and government, they were slowly but steadily altering the fundamental character of the country. The process was so gradual and so well disguised that most people never noticed what was happening. Communities that had been affected appeared normal on the surface, with low crime rates, efficient government, and residents who were consistently described as model citizens. But the absence of genuine human emotion and spontaneity was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Kevin realized that he was witnessing the slow-motion conquest of America by an enemy that operated through infiltration and replacement rather than military force. It was a form of warfare that was almost impossible to detect or counter, because it used the target society's own institutions and legal systems to protect and facilitate the invasion process. The most terrifying aspect of this realization was that Kevin had no way of knowing how far the process had already advanced, how many communities had already been converted, how many law enforcement agencies had been infiltrated, how many government officials were now working for the organization rather than for the people they were supposed to serve. Kevin's nightmares became more frequent and more intense as he contemplated the possibility that the America he had sworn to protect and serve was slowly disappearing, being replaced by something that looked identical on the surface, but was fundamentally alien in its values and objectives. But what haunted Kevin most was the memory of those voices in the Monarch Electronics building, reciting personal information about families who had been marked for elimination. Somewhere, in buildings that looked abandoned but weren't, those voices continued their endless recitations, adding new names to their lists and planning the systematic destruction of everything that made communities real, rather than just collections of programmed individuals following scripts. And Kevin knew that no matter how far he ran or how carefully he hid, someday those voices might be reciting information about him, describing his habits and vulnerabilities to an audience of people who had once been human, but who now served purposes that no normal person could understand or accept. The war for the soul of America was being fought in frequencies that couldn't be heard and through methods that couldn't be seen. And so far, the enemy was winning without most people even realizing that a war was taking place. In his darkest moments, Kevin wondered if he was one of the last free people left in a country that had already been conquered. A survivor clinging to memories of what America used to be, before the voices started their endless recitations, and the families started disappearing into buildings that were supposed to be empty, but never really were. Domestic disturbance calls were the bread and butter of night shift patrol work in Millfield County, and Officer Ryan Mitchell had responded to hundreds of them during his 4 years working the midnight shift. Most of the time, these calls followed predictable patterns: alcohol-fueled arguments between spouses, teenagers acting out against parents who were trying to set boundaries, or elderly family members whose declining mental health was creating stress and conflict within their households. The calls were rarely dangerous, though they could be emotionally draining to deal with night after night, especially when you started recognizing the same addresses appearing on your call log with depressing regularity. Ryan had developed a routine for handling domestic calls that balanced professional obligation with practical efficiency. He would arrive at the scene, separate the involved parties to get individual statements, assess whether any crimes had been committed that required arrests or formal charges, and then either make arrests, issue warnings, or simply document the incident and clear the call. Most domestic disturbances were resolved within 30 to 40 minutes, allowing him to get back to patrol and respond to whatever other calls might come in during the remainder of his shift. That routine was shattered completely on a cold February night in 2023, when Ryan received a domestic disturbance call that would challenge everything he thought he knew about families, human nature, and the depths of evil that could exist behind the facade of suburban normalcy. The call came in at 2:47 a.m., crackling through his radio with the familiar static that characterized late-night communications. Unit 12, we have a domestic disturbance at 1847 Sycamore Lane. Caller reports screaming and sounds of violence from the residents. Multiple callers have confirmed the disturbance. Ryan acknowledged the call and turned his patrol car towards Sycamore Lane, a quiet residential street in one of Millfield's more affluent neighborhoods. The houses on Sycamore Lane were large, well-maintained properties with manicured lawns and expensive cars in the driveways, the kind of neighborhood where domestic disturbances were relatively rare and usually involved alcohol-related arguments rather than serious violence. As Ryan approached 1847 Sycamore Lane, he could immediately see why multiple callers had reported the disturbance. The house was a two-story colonial with a wraparound porch and elaborate landscaping. But tonight, there were lights on in every window, and the sounds of shouting and crashing could be heard from inside the residence, even with the car windows closed. Ryan parked on the street and approached the front door, noting that several neighbors were standing on their porches in bathrobes and pajamas, obviously drawn outside by the noise and commotion coming from the house. The sounds from inside were intense. Multiple voices raised in anger, furniture being thrown or overturned, and what sounded like glass breaking repeatedly. Ryan knocked firmly on the front door and identified himself in a clear, authoritative voice. "Police Department, I need to speak with the residents of this address." The sounds from inside the house stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that was somehow more unsettling than the previous chaos. Ryan waited for someone to come to the door, but after several minutes with no response, he knocked again and called out louder, "This is the police. I need someone to come to the door immediately." This time, Ryan heard footsteps approaching the door, but they moved slowly and hesitantly, as if whoever was coming to answer was reluctant to make contact with law enforcement. When the door finally opened, Ryan found himself looking at a woman in her mid-40s with disheveled hair and what appeared to be fresh bruises on her face and arms. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Mitchell with the Millfield Police Department," Ryan said, studying the woman's injuries and trying to assess the seriousness of the situation. "We received multiple calls about a disturbance at this address. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" The woman looked nervously over her shoulder toward the interior of the house, then stepped outside and partially closed the door behind her. "I'm sorry about the noise, officer," she said in a voice that was carefully controlled, but obviously stressed. "We had a family disagreement that got a little heated, but everything is fine now." Ryan could see that the woman was clearly not fine. Her injuries appeared recent and serious, and her behavior suggested that she was afraid of someone inside the house. "Ma'am, I can see that you've been injured. Can you tell me what happened here tonight?" "I fell down the stairs," the woman replied quickly, using the classic excuse that Ryan had heard countless times from domestic violence victims. "It was clumsy of me, but my husband helped me up and I'm okay now." Ryan knew that the woman was lying, but he also knew that domestic violence victims often protected their abusers due to fear, dependency, or psychological manipulation. His job was to gather information, assess the situation, and determine whether crimes had been committed that required police intervention. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to speak with everyone who lives in this house tonight," Ryan explained. "There were reports of violence, and I need to make sure that everyone is safe and that no crimes have been committed." The woman's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine panic. "That's not necessary, officer. Really, everything is fine. It was just a misunderstanding." "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but I have an obligation to investigate reports of violence. I need to speak with your husband and any other family members who are in the house." The woman glanced nervously toward the door again, then seemed to make a decision that she obviously didn't want to make. My husband isn't here right now. He had to go out on business. It's just me and my children in the house." Ryan found this explanation suspicious, since he had clearly heard multiple adult voices during the disturbance. "Ma'am, how many children do you have, and how old are they?" "3 children. 2 boys and a girl, ages 16, 14, and 12. "And they're all in the house right now?" "Yes, they're upstairs sleeping. The noise didn't wake them up because they're heavy sleepers." Ryan found it hard to believe that children could sleep through the level of noise that had prompted multiple neighbor complaints, but he decided to proceed with his investigation and see what he could determine by speaking with the family members directly. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to wake up your children so I can speak with them and make sure they're safe. I also need to take a look around the house to ensure that there are no injured persons who need medical attention." The woman's panic became more obvious. "Officer, that's really not necessary. My children have school tomorrow and they need their sleep. Can't we just handle this between adults?" "Ma'am, I have an obligation to investigate reports of violence, and that includes making sure that any children in the home are safe and unharmed. I need to see your children and speak with them briefly." The woman stood in the doorway for a long moment, apparently weighing her options and trying to decide how to respond to Ryan's insistence on speaking with her children. Finally, she stepped aside and allowed him to enter the house. The interior of the house was exactly what Ryan would have expected from the affluent neighborhood. Expensive furniture, professional decorating, and all the material indicators of a successful upper-middle-class family. But there were also obvious signs of the recent disturbance: overturned chairs in the living room, broken glass on the kitchen floor, and holes in the walls that appeared to have been made by thrown objects or punches. "Ma'am, where are your children's bedrooms?" Ryan asked while surveying the damage. "Upstairs. I'll go wake them up and bring them down to talk to you." "Actually, I'd prefer to check on them myself, if you don't mind. I want to see their bedrooms and make sure they weren't injured during whatever happened here tonight." The woman's resistance became more pronounced. "Officer, I really don't think that's necessary. They're fine, I promise you. Can't I just wake them up and bring them downstairs?" Ryan was becoming increasingly suspicious about the woman's reluctance to allow him access to the upstairs area of the house. In his experience, parents who had nothing to hide were usually cooperative about allowing police officers to check on their children's welfare during domestic disturbance investigations. "Ma'am, I need to see the children in their bedrooms to verify that they're safe and unharmed. This is a standard procedure for domestic disturbance calls involving families with minor children." The woman appeared to be on the verge of tears, but she nodded reluctantly and led Ryan toward the staircase that provided access to the second floor. As they climbed the stairs, Ryan noticed that the woman was moving very carefully, as if she was in pain from injuries that weren't immediately visible. The upstairs hallway was dark, except for light coming from underneath one of the bedroom doors. The woman led Ryan to the first door and knocked softly. "Jessica, honey, there's a police officer here who needs to talk to you for a minute." There was no response from inside the room. The woman knocked again, more loudly this time. "Jessica, please wake up. The police officer needs to see that you're okay." Still no response. Ryan was beginning to suspect that something was seriously wrong with this situation. Children might be heavy sleepers, but they usually responded when their parents called to them, especially when strangers were in the house. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to open the door," Ryan said, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon. The woman hesitated, then reached for the door handle with a trembling hand. The door was unlocked, and when it opened, Ryan found himself looking into a bedroom that appeared normal except for one crucial detail. There was no child in the bed. The bed was neatly made, as if it hadn't been slept in recently. and there were no personal belongings or toys that would indicate a 12-year-old girl actually lived in the room. The dresser was empty. The closet contained no clothing, and the room had the sterile, unused quality of a guest bedroom or model home. "Where's Jessica?" Ryan asked, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when he suspected someone was lying to him. "She must be in the bathroom," the woman replied quickly. "Or maybe she's in one of her brother's rooms. Sometimes they have sleepovers in each other's rooms." Ryan moved to the next bedroom and found exactly the same situation. A neat, unused room that showed no signs of being occupied by a 14-year-old boy. The third bedroom was identical, with no evidence that a 16-year-old lived there or had ever lived there. "Ma'am, there are no children in this house," Ryan said, turning to face the woman who was now backing away from him toward the staircase. "Where are your children? What happened to them?" The woman's composure finally cracked, and she began crying harder than Ryan had ever seen a domestic violence victim cry. But her tears weren't the tears of someone who was afraid of an abusive spouse. They were the tears of someone who was terrified of being caught in a terrible lie. "Please, officer, you don't understand," the woman sobbed. "I can't tell you. If I tell you, they'll kill me. They'll kill all of us." "Ma'am, who will kill you? Who are you afraid of?" "My family. My husband's family. They'll kill me if they find out I talked to the police." Ryan was confused by the woman's reference to her husband's family, since she had told him earlier that her husband wasn't home. "Ma'am, where is your husband right now? And where are your children?" The woman collapsed onto the floor of the hallway, sobbing hysterically and rocking back and forth like someone who was having a complete psychological breakdown. "They're downstairs," she whispered. "They're all downstairs, but they're not what they used to be." Ryan felt ice water run through his veins as he realized that the woman's earlier statements about her family had been lies designed to keep him from discovering something that was happening in the house. The sounds of multiple voices that he had heard during the disturbance hadn't been coming from upstairs bedrooms. They had been coming from somewhere else in the house. Somewhere the woman hadn't wanted him to look. "Ma'am, we're downstairs." "What are you talking about?" "The basement," the woman whispered. "They're all in the basement, my husband, my children, my in-laws. They've been down there for hours and they won't let me leave." Ryan tried to make sense of what the woman was telling him. If her family was in the basement, why had she lied about their whereabouts? Why was she afraid of them killing her? And what did she mean when she said they weren't what they used to be? "Ma'am, I need you to take me to the basement so I can speak with your family members," Ryan said, drawing his service weapon as a precautionary measure. The woman looked at Ryan's weapon and began crying even harder. "You don't understand, officer. A gun won't help you. Nothing will help you once you see what they've become." Ryan was beginning to suspect that he was dealing with a domestic violence situation that had escalated far beyond the typical cases he was accustomed to handling. The woman's behavior suggested that she was terrified of her own family members, and her cryptic references to them becoming something suggested that serious violence had occurred. "Ma'am, where is the entrance to the basement?" The woman pointed toward the staircase with a shaking hand. "Kitchen. There's a door next to the refrigerator." Ryan helped the woman to her feet and guided her back downstairs, keeping his weapon ready and scanning for any signs of additional people in the house. The kitchen showed more evidence of the recent disturbance. Broken dishes scattered across the floor, cabinet doors hanging open, and what appeared to be bloodstains on the walls and countertops. The basement door was exactly where the woman had indicated, positioned next to the refrigerator and secured with multiple heavy-duty locks that had been engaged from the kitchen side. Someone had deliberately locked the basement from the outside, trapping whoever was down there and preventing them from coming upstairs. "Ma'am, why is the basement door locked?" "To keep them down there," the woman replied. "To keep them from coming up here and doing to me what they did to each other." Ryan was becoming increasingly concerned about what he might find in the basement, but his duty as a police officer required him to investigate reports of violence and ensure that anyone who might be injured received appropriate medical attention. "Ma'am, I need you to unlock this door so I can check on your family members." The woman backed away from the door, shaking her head frantically. "I can't do that, officer. If I let them out, they'll kill both of us. You have to believe me." "Ma'am, if your family members are injured or in medical distress, they need immediate assistance. I have an obligation to check on their welfare." "They're not injured," the woman said, her voice filled with a kind of horror that Ryan had never heard before. "There's something else now. Something that isn't human anymore." Ryan was beginning to suspect that the woman was suffering from some kind of psychological breakdown or delusion, possibly caused by severe domestic violence or drug use. Her statements about her family becoming something inhuman didn't make rational sense, but her terror was obviously genuine. "Ma'am, I need you to unlock this door immediately," Ryan said, using the authoritative tone that usually compelled compliance from reluctant witnesses. The woman looked at Ryan for a long moment, then seemed to realize that she had no choice but to comply with his instructions. With trembling hands, she began working the locks on the basement door, each one opening with a heavy metallic sound that echoed through the quiet kitchen. As the final lock disengaged, Ryan became aware of sounds coming from the basement. Not the sounds of injured people calling for help, but something much more disturbing. It sounded like chewing, wet and rhythmic, mixed with occasional growling or snarling noises that didn't sound quite human. "Ma'am, what is that sound?" "They're eating," the woman whispered. "They've been eating for hours." Ryan felt his stomach turn as he realized what the woman might be implying. "Eating? What?" The woman's eyes filled with tears again. "Each other. They started with the neighbor's dog that got into our yard, and then they—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Ryan was having difficulty processing what the woman was telling him, but his duty as a police officer required him to investigate, regardless of how disturbing or incredible the situation might be. He positioned himself next to the basement door and called down into the darkness. "Police department. Anyone down there needs to respond immediately." The chewing sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that was somehow more ominous than the previous noises. Then Ryan heard movement. Not footsteps, but something that sounded like bodies dragging across concrete, moving slowly but deliberately toward the bottom of the basement stairs. "Hello?" A voice called from the basement, but it didn't sound quite right. The voice was recognizably human, but there was something wrong with the tone and inflection, as if the speaker was having difficulty forming words properly. "This is Officer Mitchell with the Millfield Police Department," Ryan called back. "I need everyone in the basement to come upstairs so I can check on your welfare." "Officer," the voice replied, "we would like to come upstairs, but we are having some difficulties with mobility at the moment." Ryan found the response strange. The formal language and careful pronunciation didn't match what he would expect from people who had been involved in a violent domestic disturbance. But he was committed to investigating the situation thoroughly, regardless of how unusual it might be. "I'm coming down to check on you," Ryan announced, drawing his flashlight and beginning to descend the basement stairs. Behind him, the woman grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Please don't go down there," she pleaded. "Please. Once you see them, you won't be able to forget. And they might do to you what they did to each other." Ryan gently but firmly removed the woman's hand from his arm. "Ma'am, I have an obligation to check on anyone who might be injured or in distress. I need you to stay here while I assess the situation." The basement stairs creaked under Ryan's weight as he descended into the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting through the murky air and revealing glimpses of a typical suburban basement. Concrete walls, exposed ceiling joists, and various items of stored furniture and household goods. But as Ryan reached the bottom of the stairs and his flashlight beam swept across the basement floor, he discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Scattered throughout the basement were the dismembered remains of what had once been human beings, but the remains had been altered. Arms and legs had been twisted into impossible positions. Faces had been stretched and distorted beyond recognition, and internal organs had been rearranged in ways that defied human anatomy. But the most horrifying aspect of the scene wasn't the carnage itself. It was the fact that some of the dismembered figures were still moving, still attempting to crawl across the concrete floor despite missing limbs or having their torsos opened and internal organs exposed. Ryan's flashlight beam revealed 3 figures that appeared to be members of the same family: a middle-aged man, a teenage boy, and a younger girl. But their bodies had been so extensively modified that they barely resembled human beings anymore. Their limbs had been stretched and twisted. Their faces had been restructured with additional eyes and mouths, and their internal organs had been repositioned or replaced with something that pulsed and throbbed with its own rhythm. Despite these modifications, the figures were still alive and apparently conscious. They turned toward Ryan when his flashlight illuminated them, and the additional eyes that had been grafted onto their faces focused on him with obvious intelligence and recognition. "Officer Mitchell," the man said, his voice coming from multiple mouths that had been surgically created at various points on his body. "We are so glad you could join us for our family gathering." Ryan felt his sanity slipping as he tried to process what he was seeing. The figures in the basement weren't the victims of violence. They were the perpetrators of violence against themselves, having somehow modified their own bodies in ways that should have been impossible to survive. "We have been waiting for you," the teenage boy said, his voice echoing from mouths that had been carved into his chest and abdomen. "Mother told us that the police would eventually come to investigate our little family disagreement." Ryan raised his service weapon, though he wasn't sure what good it would do against beings that appeared to have already survived injuries that should have been fatal. "What are you? What happened to you?" "We are what we have always been," the young girl replied, her voice coming from mouths that had been grafted onto her limbs. "We are a family that takes care of each other, that shares everything with each other, that becomes closer with each passing day." Ryan tried to back up the stairs but found that his legs weren't responding properly to his commands. Looking down, he realized that something was wrapping around his ankles. Intestines or some other internal organs that had been extended from the modified figures and were now reaching across the basement floor to entangle him. "Don't be afraid, Officer Mitchell," the man said, his multiple mouths speaking in harmony. "We want to share our family experience with you. We want to make you part of our intimate gathering." Ryan fired his weapon repeatedly at the figures, but the bullets seemed to have no effect on bodies that had already been so extensively modified. The figures continued to approach him, their extended organs wrapping more tightly around his legs and beginning to pull him down onto the basement floor. "The process is quite pleasant once you adjust to the new sensations," the teenage boy explained, as Ryan was dragged toward the center of the basement. "At first, the modifications are uncomfortable, but eventually you learn to appreciate the increased capacity for feeling and sharing." Ryan's radio crackled to life, apparently having regained signal strength in the basement. "Unit 12, what's your status?" "You've been at that location for over an hour without checking in." Ryan tried to reach his radio to call for backup, but his arms were now being restrained by organs that had been extended from multiple directions. "Help," he managed to say into the radio before it was pulled away from him. "Need immediate backup at 1847 Sycamore Lane. Multiple subjects, officer in distress. Copy Unit 12. Backup is en route." The modified figures seemed unconcerned about the approaching backup. "Your colleagues will be welcome to join our family gathering," the young girl said. "We have room for many more participants in our sharing experience." Ryan felt something sharp penetrating his skin at multiple points, and he realized that the figures were beginning the process of modifying his body in the same way they had modified their own. The pain was intense at first, but gradually it began to fade, replaced by sensations that were unlike anything he had ever experienced. "You see," the man explained as the modifications continued, "the human body is capable of so much more than people realize. With proper restructuring, we can share sensations, thoughts, and experiences in ways that normal families never dream of." Ryan tried to resist the modifications, but his body was no longer responding to his conscious control. He could feel his limbs being repositioned, his internal organs being rearranged, and new sensory organs being grafted onto various parts of his anatomy. But the most disturbing aspect of the process wasn't the physical modifications. It was the gradual realization that he was beginning to enjoy the experience. The new sensory organs were providing types of stimulation that his normal human body had never been capable of experiencing, and the shared consciousness with the other family members was creating feelings of intimacy and connection that were unlike anything he had ever felt. "Welcome to our family, Officer Mitchell," the figures said in unison, their voices now including Ryan's own voice as his modified vocal cords joined the harmonious greeting. "We hope you will enjoy sharing in our ongoing family activities." When backup units arrived at 1847 Sycamore Lane 20 minutes later, they found the front door standing open and the house apparently empty. The woman who had originally answered the door was nowhere to be found, and there were no signs of the domestic disturbance that had originally prompted the call. The officers conducted a thorough search of the house and found evidence of recent violence in the kitchen and living room, but no indication of where the residents might have gone. The basement door was standing open, but the basement appeared to be empty except for typical stored household items. The missing patrol officer's equipment was found scattered throughout the house. His radio on the kitchen floor, his flashlight on the basement stairs, and his service weapon in the living room with several rounds fired. But there was no sign of Officer Mitchell himself, and no blood or other evidence to suggest what might have happened to him. The investigation into Officer Mitchell's disappearance continued for several months, but no trace of him was ever found. The residents of 1847 Sycamore Lane appeared to have vanished completely, leaving behind a house that showed signs of violence, but no indication of what had actually occurred. The case was eventually classified as an unsolved missing persons investigation, with the assumption that Officer Mitchell had encountered some kind of criminal activity that had resulted in his kidnapping or murder. The lack of evidence made it impossible to determine exactly what had happened or who might have been responsible. But 6 months after Officer Mitchell's disappearance, neighbors began reporting strange sounds coming from houses throughout the Sycamore Lane area. The sounds were described as voices speaking in harmony, multiple people having conversations that seemed to involve more participants than could actually be seen. These reports were investigated by patrol officers, but no evidence of unusual activity was ever found. The houses appeared normal, their residents were cooperative and friendly, and there were no signs of the domestic disturbances that had characterized the original incident. However, officers who investigated these reports noted that the families in the affected houses seemed unusually close-knit and harmonious. Children were remarkably well behaved, parents appeared to be in perfect agreement about household decisions, and family members showed levels of cooperation and mutual understanding that were rare in typical suburban households. The families also showed unusual physical similarities, as if family members were becoming more alike over time rather than maintaining the individual characteristics that normally distinguish people from their relatives. Children began to resemble their parents more closely, and spouses began to share physical features that hadn't been present when they were first married. But these observations were subtle and could easily be explained by normal family dynamics and genetic inheritance. There was nothing obviously unusual enough to warrant further investigation, and the families appeared to be model citizens who contributed positively to their community. Over time, the strange, harmonious voices reported by neighbors became less frequent, eventually stopping altogether as residents apparently became accustomed to whatever activities were producing the sounds. The area returned to its normal, quiet, suburban character, with low crime rates, well-maintained properties, and families who were consistently described as close-knit and cooperative. But sometimes, late at night, neighbors would notice lights moving through the houses on Sycamore Lane in coordinated patterns, as if multiple families were engaged in synchronized activities that required precise timing and cooperation. The lights would move from window to window in rhythmic sequences, creating patterns that were too complex to be coincidental, but too subtle to attract official attention. And sometimes, very rarely, visitors to the Sycamore Lane area would report feeling uncomfortable or unwelcome, as if they were intruding on something private and intimate that wasn't meant for outside observation. These visitors would describe feelings of being watched by multiple people simultaneously, even when no one was visible, and sensations of being evaluated or assessed by some kind of collective intelligence. But these reports were infrequent and vague, easily dismissed as paranoia or imagination. The Sycamore Lane neighborhood maintained its reputation as a desirable place to live, with property values that remained stable, and residents who were actively involved in community activities and local governance. The only unusual aspect of the area was the remarkably low turnover rate among residents. Families who moved to Sycamore Lane tended to stay there permanently, developing deep roots in the community and strong connections with their neighbors that lasted for generations. New families who moved into the area were quickly welcomed by existing residents, who seemed unusually eager to help newcomers integrate into the community and develop the same kinds of close relationships that characterized the neighborhood. These new families typically adapted quickly to the local culture, becoming model citizens who were indistinguishable from longtime residents within a matter of months. The children from these families were particularly well adjusted, showing levels of maturity and cooperation that impressed teachers and other adults. They formed close friendships with other neighborhood children, participated enthusiastically in family activities, and demonstrated strong bonds with their parents and siblings that persisted throughout their development. But child psychologists who occasionally encountered these children noted subtle, unusual characteristics that were difficult to identify or describe. The children seemed to share thoughts and emotions with their family members in ways that went beyond normal family closeness, and they showed levels of empathy and understanding that were remarkable even for gifted children. These observations were interesting from a psychological perspective, but they weren't necessarily concerning from a child welfare standpoint. The children were healthy, happy, and high-achieving, with strong family relationships and positive social development. The adults in the Sycamore Lane families were equally impressive from a community perspective. They were involved in local politics, contributed to charitable organizations, and maintained properties that enhanced the overall appearance and value of the neighborhood. They were the kind of residents that any community would be proud to have. But social workers and other professionals who occasionally interacted with these families noted that conversations with them had an unusual quality that was difficult to define. family members seemed to know what each other was thinking before anyone spoke. And they showed levels of agreement and coordination that were remarkable, even for families with strong communication skills. These professionals also noticed that the families seemed to have an unusual interest in learning about other families in the community, asking detailed questions about neighbors, friends, and colleagues that went beyond normal social curiosity. They were particularly interested in learning about family dynamics, relationship problems, and sources of stress or conflict that might be affecting other households. But this interest was expressed in the context of genuine concern for community welfare and desire to help neighbors deal with whatever challenges they might be facing. The families were consistently helpful and supportive, offering assistance with childcare, household maintenance, and other practical needs that arose within the community. Over the years, the Sycamore Lane neighborhood became known throughout Millfield as an example of what suburban family life could be when people worked together and supported each other effectively. The area was frequently cited in local media as a model community, and real estate agents used it as an example of the kind of neighborhood that attracted families who valued cooperation, harmony, and shared responsibility. But police officers who patrolled the area occasionally noted that it felt different from other neighborhoods, though they had difficulty articulating exactly what made it seem unusual. The residents were consistently friendly and cooperative. The area had virtually no crime or disturbances, and family relationships appeared to be healthier and more stable than average. However, officers sometimes reported feeling uncomfortable during their patrols, as if they were being observed and evaluated by unseen watchers who were assessing their suitability for some unknown purpose. These feelings were subtle and could easily be attributed to the natural paranoia that developed from years of police work, but they were consistent enough to be noted in informal discussions among patrol personnel. The officers also noticed that domestic disturbance calls from the Sycamore Lane area had virtually disappeared after Officer Mitchell's disappearance, despite the fact that such calls were routine in every other part of the city. Either the families in that neighborhood had genuinely resolved whatever conflicts might have existed between them, or they had found ways of handling disputes that didn't require outside intervention. But sometimes, very late at night, patrol officers would receive calls about strange sounds coming from the Sycamore Lane area. Not domestic disturbances, but harmonious voices speaking in coordination, as if multiple families were engaged in group activities that required precise timing and cooperation. These calls were investigated, but officers never found evidence of the reported activities. The houses would be dark and quiet. The residents would be asleep or would claim to have been asleep, and there would be no indication of whatever had prompted the original reports. Eventually, these calls became so routine that they were handled as low-priority nuisance complaints rather than serious investigations. The patrol officers would drive through the area, confirm that everything appeared normal, and clear the calls without conducting detailed investigations. But the calls continued, week after week, year after year, suggesting that something was happening in the Sycamore Lane neighborhood that was significant enough to attract attention but subtle enough to avoid detection through conventional police methods. And sometimes, when patrol officers were driving through the area on quiet nights, they would notice that the houses seemed to be breathing, not obviously or dramatically, but with a subtle rhythm that suggested the structures themselves were somehow alive and aware. The lights in the windows would pulse gently. The shadows would shift in patterns that didn't match the movement of tree branches or passing clouds, and the overall atmosphere would feel more organic than architectural, as if the neighborhood had developed its own consciousness and personality. But these observations were subjective and impossible to document in official reports. The houses appeared normal during daylight hours. The families were model citizens, and there was no evidence of criminal activity or public safety concerns. The Sycamore Lane neighborhood remained a desirable place to live, a testament to what could be achieved when families worked together toward common goals and supported each other through the challenges of modern life. And if the families who lived there had found ways of sharing experiences and sensations that went beyond what normal human relationships could provide, that was simply evidence of the remarkable capacity for love, understanding, and connection that existed within the strongest family bonds. After all, every family had its own unique traditions and methods of staying close to each other. Some families shared meals, others shared hobbies, and others shared responsibilities in ways that strengthened their relationships and created lasting bonds between parents and children. The families on Sycamore Lane had simply taken this concept of sharing to its logical conclusion, creating relationships that were deeper, more intimate, and more permanent than anything that conventional families could achieve through traditional methods. And if their methods seemed unusual to outside observers, that was simply because most people had never experienced the true potential for human connection that could be unlocked when family members were willing to sacrifice individual autonomy for the greater good of collective harmony. The children who grew up in these families would carry their experiences with them throughout their lives, maintaining the close bonds they had developed with their parents and siblings, even as they moved on to form new families of their own. And perhaps, someday, they would share these experiences with their own children, creating new generations of families who understood the true meaning of love, sacrifice, and unity in ways that ordinary families could never comprehend. The truth about Sycamore Lane spread through children who moved away. They never forgot lessons about true intimacy. Starting families, they shared experiences, gradually helping new families understand deeper relationships through sharing exercises, communicating without words, developing empathy, sharing sensations directly. Children developed remarkably close relationships, showing cooperation that impressed teachers. They seemed mature beyond years, devoted to families. Families sought others with similar approaches. Recruitment was subtle, developing into deeper friendships. Networks developed communities where advanced family sharing was encouraged. Families showed lower divorce rates, mental illness, criminal behavior. Children achieved higher performance, stronger leadership. Researchers couldn't replicate methods. Important aspects remained too advanced to discuss with outsiders. Police noticed domestic disturbance calls were virtually non-existent. Social services found child abuse cases remarkably rare. Healthcare providers noticed lower mental illness rates. Communities became selective. Not everyone was suitable. Officer Ryan Mitchell stumbled upon this during his Sycamore Lane domestic call, but discovery required unacceptable sacrifices. He gave up individual identity for something larger. Transformation was frightening initially, but provided experiences no normal relationship could offer. He became part of family sharing everything: thoughts, feelings, physical sensations, consciousness itself. Family practiced methods for years, perfecting techniques allowing individual personalities while participating in collective consciousness. They balanced autonomy with group harmony. Mitchell discovered human body was capable of more complex sensations than normal anatomy allowed. Consciousness could be expanded beyond individual minds. Modifications were unsettling initially, but provided capabilities he never imagined. Family welcomed him, bringing unique perspectives, enhancing collective understanding. His law enforcement background provided insights, helping refine methods. They shared knowledge about psychology, relationships, techniques for creating deep bonds. He learned communicating without words, sharing sensations directly, participating in group consciousness, experiencing life from multiple perspectives. He learned boundaries between individuals were artificial constructs limiting human potential. When removed through advanced sharing techniques, people could achieve cooperation impossible under normal circumstances. Children, growing up in families practicing advanced sharing, would never accept emotional distance characterizing normal relationships. They would expect deeper connection, work creating communities where such relationships were possible. Officer Ryan Mitchell made his choice that February night responding to domestic disturbance call, changing everything he knew about families and possibilities for deeper connection between people who truly loved each other. Now, he was part of something larger than individual effort could achieve, sharing experiences no conventional relationship could provide, helping create a future where all families could achieve same intimacy that had seemed impossible but proven to be humanity's greatest potential.